Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, even when you knew you were alone? It started a few weeks ago. My apartment faces another building, its windows like glowing boxes of life in the dark. Late one night, as I closed my laptop and stretched, my eyes were drawn to a window directly across from mine. A woman stood there, framed by dim light. She didn't move, not even a shift in weight or a tilt of her head. At first, I thought it was a mannequin or some kind of shadow. But every night since then, she has been there. Same position, same unnervingly still posture. I started leaving the curtains open, pretending to read or scroll through my phone while sneaking glances her way. No matter how long I watched, she remained frozen. The faint outlines of her pale face were turned in my direction, as if she was staring straight at me. By the end of the first week, my curiosity had turned to unease. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was someone grieving, stuck in her own thoughts. But something didn't sit right. One night, I waved at her, a nervous gesture to break the tension. She didn't respond. The nights passed, and her presence began to weigh on me. It wasn't just her stillness, it was the way everything around her seemed too quiet. The other apartments in her building bustled with life. TVs flickered, people moved behind curtains, laughter echoed faintly through the night. But her window? It was like a void, silent and detached. Last night, I decided to take a closer look. I grabbed my coat and went outside, my breath forming clouds in the chilly air. The building across the street was older, its bricks weathered and windows dusty. Standing at its base, I looked up. Her apartment was dark, the faint outline of the window barely visible. The lobby door was locked, but a resident exited just as I arrived, and I slipped in behind them. The air inside was stale, heavy with neglect. I climbed the stairs, counting the floors until I reached hers. When I stood in front of the door, my heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my thoughts. The number matched the window I had been watching. My fingers hovered over the door, ready to knock, but I hesitated. Something was wrong. I leaned closer, pressing my ear against the wood. The faintest sound reached me, a soft, rhythmic noise, like whispering or breathing. My chest tightened, and I pulled away, my instinct screaming at me to leave. But before I could turn, the door creaked open on its own. The apartment was dark, but I could make out the faint shape of furniture, covered in thick layers of dust. The air was cold and heavy, smelling faintly of mildew and something metallic. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. I stepped inside, my shoes crunching on debris scattered across the floor. The room felt abandoned, like no one had lived there for years. But then I saw it, the window. The one I had stared at for weeks. A chill ran down my spine. From this angle, I could see my own apartment across the street. But something about the view felt wrong. The glass was cracked, and etched into the grime on the inside were faint marks, long, jagged scratches as if someone had clawed at it. And then I heard it again. The breathing. It wasn't coming from outside the window. It was behind me. My body froze, every instinct screaming for me to run. The sound was low and raspy, like air being dragged through a throat too dry to speak. Slowly, I turned my head, the shadows in the room seeming to stretch and twist around me. At first, I saw nothing but the dim outlines of old furniture and peeling wallpaper. But then, in the corner of the room, something shifted. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice cracking. The whispering stopped. The silence was worse. I took a step back, bumping into a small table that wobbled and sent a cloud of dust into the air. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled for my phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, landing on an empty corner. There was nothing there. But the feeling of being watched didn't fade, it only grew stronger. The whispering started again, soft and disjointed. It wasn't words, just fragments of sounds that seemed to come from all around me. I spun the flashlight, its beam dancing wildly across the walls. "Show yourself," I shouted, the words bursting from me in desperation. The room fell silent once more. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs. I inched toward the door, my eyes never leaving the shadows. But as I reached the threshold, something caught my attention, a photograph lying face down on a nearby table. Against every ounce of reason, I moved closer, my hand shaking as I picked it up. Turning it over, I saw a black and white image of a woman standing by the very same window I'd been watching. She wore a long, dark dress, her hair pinned neatly back. But it was her face that sent a jolt of terror through me. It wasn't just pale, it was blurred, as if someone had smudged the photo while it was developing. Her features were indistinct except for her eyes. They were sharp, staring directly at the camera, and they seemed alive, almost too real for the image. A sudden noise behind me made me drop the photo. It clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the apartment. I turned, my flashlight flickering. The door to the bedroom at the end of the hall was open now. It hadn't been before. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. This time, it sounded like my name. I backed away, my body trembling, but something compelled me to look. Slowly, I moved toward the bedroom, the light in my hand shaking with every step. The door creaked as I pushed it further open. The room was empty, except for a single chair in the center. On it sat a small, ornate box, covered in dust. The whispering stopped the moment I stepped inside. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me like a weight. I approached the chair, my hand reaching out for the box. It felt cold to the touch, the metal edges biting into my skin as I lifted it. The lid was latched, but the mechanism seemed fragile, as if it would break with the slightest pressure. Part of me screamed to leave it alone, to throw it away and run. But I couldn't. Something inside me had to know. I unlatched the lid and opened it. Inside was a lock of dark hair, tied with a red ribbon. Beneath it, a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. I unfolded it carefully, the paper crackling in the silence. Written in shaky handwriting were the words, "She watches because she waits. Don't let her in." Before I could process the message, the whispering erupted around me, louder than ever. The room seemed to darken, the shadows twisting violently. And then I saw her. She stood in the doorway, her blurred face illuminated by the faint glow of my flashlight. Those same piercing eyes from the photograph stared back at me, full of malice and hunger. I stumbled backward, clutching the box to my chest. The room spun, my vision blurring as the whispering grew into a deafening roar. And then, everything went black. I woke to silence. My head throbbed, and the air felt dense, as though it had been sucked out of the room. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was. Then I saw the box, still clutched in my hands, and the memory of her, those eyes, hit me like a tidal wave. The room was exactly as I had left it, but the door to the hallway was now closed. No whispers. No shadows. Just the faint hum of my own breathing. I scrambled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady. The urge to leave was overpowering, but something about the box felt significant, like it held answers I didn't yet understand. My flashlight had rolled to the floor, its beam pointing at the chair. I grabbed it, noticing faint marks on the wood where the box had rested, deep scratches, as if something had clawed at it for hours. I stepped into the hallway, each creak of the old floorboards making me wince. The apartment seemed darker than before, the air heavier. The smell of mildew and metal lingered, stronger now, almost choking. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice breaking the oppressive silence. Nothing answered. I moved toward the door leading out of the apartment, but as I reached for the handle, I noticed something strange. The door was covered in faint, smeared handprints. They weren't mine. I yanked the door open and bolted down the stairs, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty building. When I burst outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. The street was quiet, almost eerily so. I turned to look up at the window where she had stood every night. It was dark, lifeless. But she was there. I could see her silhouette against the faint glow of the streetlights, motionless as always, staring directly at me. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back. I needed answers. At home, I placed the box on my kitchen table, staring at it like it might spring to life. The words on the note echoed in my mind. She watches because she waits. Don't let her in. What did it mean? Who was she? I opened my laptop and began searching for anything I could find about the building. Old news articles, forums, even conspiracy blogs. At first, there was nothing unusual. A fire decades ago, a few reports of squatters, the usual wear and tear of an old structure. But then I found something buried deep in an archived forum. The woman in the window, it read. The thread was old, nearly a decade. The first post described sightings of a woman who stood in the same spot every night, watching. Others chimed in, sharing their own experiences. Some claimed to have seen her move, just slightly, a tilt of her head or a shift in her stance. The final post chilled me to my core. If you see her, don't acknowledge her. Don't wave, don't look too long. And whatever you do, don't go to her apartment. She doesn't just watch, she waits. Once you step inside, she's with you forever. The air seemed to drain from the room. My stomach churned as I reread the words. I had broken every rule. The whispering started again. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of my laptop. But it grew louder, more insistent, filling the room like a storm. I turned, and there she was, standing outside my window, staring in. Her face was clearer now, the smudged blur replaced with sharp, unnatural features. Her eyes bored into mine, filled with a hunger that made my skin crawl. I backed away, but the whispering followed me, surrounding me. The shadows in the room stretched, pooling in the corners like ink. The note's warning rang in my head, don't let her in. But it was too late. The whispering stopped, and I realized with horrifying clarity that it wasn't coming from her anymore. It was coming from behind me. I didn't want to turn around. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, but my legs refused to move. The whispering was so close now, rasping and fragmented, like 100 voices overlapping. Slowly, I turned, clutching the edge of the table for support. The shadows in the room writhed like living things. In the center of the kitchen, something began to take shape, a figure rising out of the darkness. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its movements unnaturally smooth. But it wasn't her. This thing had no face, just a featureless void where its head should have been. The box on the table started to vibrate, a low hum resonating from it. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening, and the thing in the shadows took a step toward me. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The noise startled me, and for a moment, I felt the weight of reality return. I grabbed the box and ran for the door, the whispering chasing me, filling every corner of the apartment. The hallway outside was pitch black, but I didn't stop. I sprinted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my panic. By the time I reached the street, my lungs burned, and the cold air felt like needles on my skin. I turned to look up at my window. She was there, standing in my apartment now. Her blurred face pressed against the glass, her eyes locked on me. I didn't go back to my apartment that night. Instead, I drove aimlessly, trying to shake the feeling that something was following me. The box sat on the passenger seat, its presence a constant reminder of what I had seen. By dawn, I found myself parked outside a library. Exhausted but desperate for answers, I went inside and began combing through old records and newspapers. Hours passed before I found something that made my blood run cold. An article from 50 years ago described a woman named Margaret Elwood who lived in the building across from mine. She was reclusive, rarely seen outside her apartment. Neighbors reported strange noises, whispers, scratching sounds, even faint cries late at night. One day, the police broke into her apartment after weeks of silence. They found it empty, except for a single chair by the window and an ornate box sitting on the table. The article ended with a chilling detail. Witnesses claimed that after Margaret's disappearance, her figure was seen standing at the window every night, staring out. Those who looked too long reported seeing her face in their dreams and hearing whispers they couldn't escape. I felt the weight of the box in my lap. The whispers hadn't stopped since I left my apartment. They were quieter now, more insistent, almost pleading. The note from the box flashed in my mind, "Don't let her in." But it was too late. She wasn't just watching me anymore. She was with me. That night, I decided to destroy the box. I drove to an empty lot on the outskirts of town, armed with gasoline and a matchbook. The wind howled around me as I set the box on the ground, its ornate surface gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The whispers grew louder, desperate and angry, as I doused it in gasoline. My hand shook as I struck the match, the flame flickering in the cold air. "I'm ending this," I muttered, dropping the match onto the box. The fire roared to life, consuming the wood and metal. For a moment, the whispers turned into a scream, a sound so inhuman and piercing that I clapped my hands over my ears. And then, silence. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of calm. I stood there, watching the flames die down until there was nothing left but ashes. I thought it was over, until I got home and found her standing in the middle of my living room. Her face was no longer blurred. It was clear, sharp, and impossibly wrong. Her mouth twisted into a cruel smile, and her eyes burned with a hatred I couldn't comprehend. "You let me in," she whispered. The lights flickered, and the shadows closed in around me. And then, the world went dark. When I woke up, I was in my apartment, but it was no longer the same. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light, their surface warped as though something beneath them struggled to break free. The air felt thick and damp, the faint metallic tang of blood filling my nostrils. She was gone. Or at least, I couldn't see her. But I could feel her. Every shadow in the room seemed alive, stretching and bending toward me no matter where I moved. The whispers were back, faint and incessant, weaving through my thoughts like a melody I couldn't shake. I stumbled to the kitchen, searching for anything that might anchor me to reality. The table was bare, the box I'd burned reduced to ashes that now coated my hands. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to piece together what had happened. And then I saw it, the photograph. It was lying on the floor where I had dropped it in her apartment, but the image had changed. The woman was no longer standing alone by the window. I was there too, behind her, my face twisted in fear. A chill ran through me. I turned the photo over and scrawled on the back with the words, "You can't destroy what you invited in." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Burning the box hadn't freed me, it had only made her stronger. Over the next few days, I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Her voice filled my mind, whispering things I couldn't understand but couldn't ignore. I tried everything, researching exorcisms, reaching out to paranormal investigators, even staying in motels to escape the apartment. But no matter where I went, she followed. Every reflection showed her watching me, her sharp eyes peering from mirrors, windows, even puddles on the street. The whispers grew louder, more coherent, until I could hear her voice clearly. "You let me in," she repeated, over and over. "Now you're mine." One night, as I sat in the dim glow of my laptop, a desperate thought struck me. If I couldn't destroy her, maybe I could understand her. I returned to her apartment. The building seemed even more decrepit than before, its walls sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. The air was colder, the silence oppressive. Her door was open. Inside, the room was unchanged, except for the window. This time, it was wide open, the night air spilling into the space. The chair was back in its place, and on it sat another box, identical to the first. My hands trembled as I approached it, the whispers growing deafening with each step. I opened it. Inside was a small mirror, its surface cracked and darkened with age. When I looked into it, my reflection was wrong. My face was pale, my eyes sunken and haunted, but behind me, she stood, her smile widening as I stared. Her voice filled my mind, clearer than ever. "It's your turn now. Watch." The room spun, and I felt myself being pulled toward the window. The last thing I saw before everything went black was my own apartment across the street, its window glowing faintly in the night. I woke standing by the window, my hands pressed against the cold glass. The city outside was quiet, and the apartment across from me was dark, save for one dimly lit window. Inside, someone was watching me. Their face was pale and blurred, but I could see the fear in their posture as they stared at me. I tried to scream, to move, to wave and warn them, but my body refused to obey. I could only stand there, frozen, as they turned away from the window and disappeared into the shadows of their home. The whispers began again, soft and unrelenting. And I understood. She wasn't just watching. She was waiting for someone else to take my place. Have you ever noticed something in your home that felt out of place? Not just untidy or moved, but something that shouldn't exist at all? That's what happened to me. It was late, close to midnight, and I had just come back from one of those endless workdays that blur into each other. the kind where every step to your front door feels like a small victory. My apartment was a haven, quiet, familiar, and mine. Or so I thought. As I kicked off my shoes and shrugged off my coat, something caught my eye. A door. It stood at the end of my hallway, where my bookshelf should have been. At first, I froze, blinking hard as though my exhaustion had conjured it. The hallway was narrow, and I'd walked it thousands of times. There was no mistaking it. This door wasn't supposed to be here. It looked old, the kind you'd find in a house built decades ago. The wood was dark and weathered, with deep grooves that hinted at age and wear. A brass doorknob gleamed faintly under the dim light of the hallway. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation. Had someone broken in? Had I somehow forgotten about a renovation I'd scheduled? None of it made sense. I reached out, hesitating as my fingers hovered over the knob. It felt cold, even before I touched it, and I yanked my hand back like a child pulling away from a flame. Something about the door felt wrong, as if it didn't belong, not just in my apartment, but in this world. I tried to ignore it. The night passed in a haze of unease. I locked my bedroom door, something I hadn't done in years, and kept the lights on until sleep claimed me. When I woke the next morning, I hoped it had all been a dream. But as I stepped into the hallway, there it was, standing at the end, solid and unyielding. I called my landlord, trying to keep my voice steady. He sounded confused, even annoyed. "There's no door there," he said firmly. "I've managed this building for 20 years. I'd know if there was." After the call, I stood in the hallway, staring at the door. My curiosity began to outweigh my fear. If the landlord didn't know about it, and if it wasn't a prank, then what was it? The day dragged on. At work, I couldn't focus. The image of that door haunted me. Each time I blinked, I saw it, a dark silhouette at the end of a too-quiet hallway. That evening, I stood in front of it again. I don't know what I expected. Maybe for it to be gone, for the world to right itself. But it was still there, solid and silent. I pressed my ear against the wood, my heart pounding. Nothing. The air around it felt colder than the rest of the apartment. I could feel it seeping through the cracks, chilling my skin. "Just open it," I whispered to myself, the words barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I placed a strip of tape across the seam where the door met the frame, a small test to see if it moved while I slept. That night, I dreamed of it. In the dream, the hallway stretched impossibly long, the door looming at the end. I walked toward it, my steps echoing in the silence. The doorknob turned on its own, the creak of the hinges deafening. The last thing I saw before waking up was a black void beyond the threshold, and something moving inside it. When I woke, the tape was gone. Not broken. Not ripped. Just gone. I checked the floor, the walls, even the trash, but there was no trace of it. My hands trembled as I stared at the door. Whatever was behind it, it wasn't waiting for my permission. That night, I decided I was going to open it. I stood in front of the door, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. My fingers hovered over the cold brass doorknob, trembling as though they already knew something my mind refused to accept. The hallway was eerily silent, the kind of silence that swallows sound and thought alike. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as I finally gripped the doorknob and turned it. The door opened with a groan that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. I expected to see a wall, maybe some hidden closet I had forgotten existed. Instead, I was met with a passageway that stretched far beyond the confines of my apartment. It was narrow and dimly lit, the faint glow coming from no discernible source. The walls were a mix of stone and wood, cracked and worn as though they had been there for centuries. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to close the door and walk away. But curiosity is a powerful thing, stronger even than fear. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The air was colder here, and it smelled of damp earth and something metallic. My footsteps echoed unnaturally as I moved forward, the sound bouncing back to me distorted and hollow. The door behind me remained open, the only tether to the safety of my apartment. As I walked, the corridor seemed to shift subtly, the walls bending and stretching in ways that defied logic. The faint light flickered, casting elongated shadows that danced across the uneven surfaces. The further I went, the harder it became to convince myself this was real. Then I saw it. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible in the weak light. It was still, unerringly so, as though frozen in time. I froze too, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was humanoid, but its proportions were off, arms too long, head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. But the air grew heavier, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. My chest tightened, and I struggled to breathe. I took a step back, and that's when it moved. Not forward. Not toward me. It shifted sideways, dissolving into the shadows like smoke. The light flickered again, plunging the passage into near darkness. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run back to the door, but it was no longer there. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, the doorway to my apartment gone as though it had never existed. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I spun in circles, desperately searching for any sign of escape. A sound broke the silence, a low, guttural scraping, like metal dragging against stone. It came from behind me, growing louder with every passing second. I didn't want to turn around, but I couldn't stop myself. The figure was back, closer now, its outline clearer in the dim light. Its head twitched unnaturally, jerking from side to side as it took a slow, deliberate step toward me. I ran. The corridor twisted and turned, each corner revealing another stretch of the same endless passage. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. The sound of footsteps followed me, impossibly fast and unrelenting. Finally, I stumbled into a larger room, the walls opening up into a cavernous space. In the center of the room stood a single wooden table, and on it lay an object covered in a black cloth. I approached it cautiously, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but there was nowhere else to go. With trembling hands, I pulled back the cloth. It was a mirror. The surface was cracked and stained, but my reflection stared back at me, distorted and wrong. My face was pale, my eyes hollow and sunken, but behind me, the figure loomed, its featureless face inches from mine. I spun around, but the room was empty. The air was still, and the sound of footsteps had vanished. My reflection, however, remained in the mirror, unchanged. A voice whispered in my mind, soft and cold. "You shouldn't have come." The light in the room began to fade, and the walls seemed to close in around me. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was my own reflection, smiling, a smile that wasn't mine. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold stone floor of the corridor again. My head throbbed, and my body ached as though I had been dropped from a great height. For a moment, I thought I was back in my apartment, that the door, the figure, the mirror had all been some vivid nightmare. But then I opened my eyes. The dim light was back, flickering faintly, and the corridor stretched endlessly in both directions. The air was damp and heavy, carrying that same metallic tang. My heartbeat quickened as the memory of what had happened came flooding back. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs shaky beneath me. The room with the mirror was gone, and so was the figure. But the sense of being watched lingered, an oppressive weight pressing on my every move. I chose a direction at random and started walking. The corridor seemed alive, shifting subtly as I moved. The walls would narrow, forcing me to squeeze through, only to widen moments later into cavernous spaces. The floor was uneven, the stones beneath my feet slick and unstable. The sounds began after a few minutes. At first, it was faint, like whispers just beyond the edge of hearing. I stopped, straining to make out the words, but they were too fragmented, too jumbled. As I moved further, the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became an incoherent chorus. Then came the footsteps. They echoed faintly at first, distant and uncertain, as though someone, or something, was trying to match my pace. Every time I stopped, they stopped. Every time I moved, they followed. I tried calling out, my voice trembling. "Who's there? What do you want?" No response. Just the steady rhythm of steps, mirroring my own. The corridor began to change. The stone walls were replaced by something else, something smoother and darker, like polished obsidian. My reflection shimmered faintly on their surface, distorted and flickering like a candle in the wind. I caught glimpses of movement in those reflections, shadows that darted and twisted just out of reach. They didn't match my movements. They seemed to have a will of their own, watching me as I stumbled forward. My fear turned to desperation. I had to find a way out. After what felt like hours, I came to another door. This one was different. Unlike the aged, wooden door in my apartment, this one was sleek and metallic, with no handle or keyhole. It stood alone in the middle of the corridor, its surface smooth and cold to the touch. I pressed my ear against it, hoping to hear something, anything, that might give me a clue. Instead, I felt the vibrations of a deep, rhythmic thudding, like a heartbeat. A small panel slid open on the door, revealing a keypad with glowing symbols. They weren't numbers or letters, but strange, angular shapes that seemed to shift as I stared at them. Panic set in. I didn't know what to do. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closing the distance. I turned, but the corridor was empty, though the air felt charged, as if something unseen was only inches away. I pressed a random sequence on the keypad, desperate for the door to open. The symbols flared brightly, and with a low hiss, the door slid open. Beyond the door was a room unlike anything I had seen. It was circular, the walls covered in pulsating veins of light that shifted through colors in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested another mirror, identical to the one I had seen before. This time, the surface was clear, and my reflection stared back at me, perfectly normal. But the longer I looked, the more I noticed the reflection wasn't copying my movements. I stepped closer, and my reflection smiled. The same cold, unnatural smile I had seen before. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice echoing in the room though its lips didn't move. I stumbled back, the pedestal and the mirror vanishing in an instant. The room grew darker, the pulsating veins dimming until only a faint glow remained. The voice returned, louder now, and it wasn't just mine. "You opened the door. Now you're part of it." The walls began to close in, the veins of light twisting and gnawing like living roots. I turned to run, but the door I had entered through was gone. The whispers turned into screams, deafening and relentless, as the room consumed me. I screamed too, but no one was there to hear it. I don't know how long I was in the darkness. Time seemed to dissolve into nothing, each moment stretching into eternity. My breath echoed in the void, shallow and ragged. I couldn't see my hands in front of me, couldn't tell if I was standing, sitting, or floating. And then, out of the oppressive black, came the light. It was faint at first, a distant pinprick, but it grew rapidly, spreading like liquid across the space around me. The world didn't return in sharp detail, it bled into existence, surreal and warped. I was back in my apartment, or at least, a version of it. The furniture was where I had left it, but everything was wrong. The walls pulsed faintly, their surfaces rippling like water. Shadows moved independently of any light source, slithering along the floor and ceiling in unnatural patterns. And the door was still there. It stood at the end of the hallway, now darker and more imposing than before. The brass doorknob gleamed, reflecting the faint, shifting glow of the walls. I wanted to scream, to demand answers from whatever force had trapped me here. But my throat felt raw, my voice lost somewhere in the abyss. The whispers began again, louder this time, distinct and deliberate. They came from everywhere and nowhere, each voice overlapping the next. Why did you open it? You shouldn't have come. There's no way out. I stumbled backward, clutching my head, trying to drown out the voices. But they weren't just in the air, they were inside me, carving through my mind like jagged glass. The shadows began to take shape, rising from the floor in twisting, humanoid forms. Their faces were blank, their movements jerky and unnatural. They didn't walk toward me, they glided, as though carried by an unseen wind. I backed into the corner, my eyes darting around the room, searching for anything that could help me. Then I saw it. On the coffee table, where there should have been a pile of unopened mail, lay a key. It was old and ornate, the metal tarnished and etched with symbols that matched those on the keypad. The whispers grew louder as I reached for it, the shadows closing in. My hand trembled as I grabbed the key, the metal icy against my skin. The moment I touched it, the room erupted in chaos. The shadows lunged at me, their forms collapsing and reforming as they surged forward. I bolted toward the hallway, the door looming ahead of me like a black hole. The floor shifted beneath my feet, the wood turning to slick stone, then to something soft and unsteady, like flesh. The air was thick and heavy, each breath a struggle. The key seemed to pulse in my hand, guiding me forward. The closer I got to the door, the more the world around me began to collapse. The walls crumbled into nothingness, the floor falling away into an endless void. I reached the door just as the last of the hallway disappeared, the shadows only a breath away. With every ounce of strength I had left, I plunged the key into the lock and turned it. The door swung open, revealing a blinding light. For a moment, I thought I had escaped, that I was free. But as I stepped through, the light faded, and I found myself back in the corridor. It was the same, yet different. The air was colder, the walls narrower, the faint light even dimmer than before. And the whispers were still there, soft and insistent. You can't leave. You are part of this now. It won't let you go. I looked down at the key in my hand, its edges glowing faintly. The symbols shifted and writhed, forming words I could finally understand. The door is only the beginning. My chest tightened as I realized the truth. This wasn't over. It might never be over. The corridor stretched on before me, endless and unyielding. The door slammed shut behind me, and I knew, deep in my soul, that I had only one choice. I had to keep moving. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, staring at the now closed door. The faint light that illuminated the corridor barely reached the edges of the space, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to writhe and shift as if alive. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent, pressing against my skull, filling my mind with a constant, maddening murmur. You can't escape. There is no way out. This is your home now. I staggered backward, unable to think clearly, my mind fogged by the endless chorus of voices. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if every breath I took was weighted with the crushing presence of something unseen, something watching me from the darkness. The walls around me seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting as if they were breathing. The corridor ahead was no longer the one I had passed through, it had shifted. The once familiar space was now an alien landscape, twisting in unnatural ways. I couldn't even remember how long I had been wandering through this place, or how many doors I had opened, if any at all. Time had no meaning here. I could feel the weight of my own exhaustion pulling me down, but the moment I allowed myself to stop moving, I felt the darkness closing in, waiting to swallow me whole. I continued walking, not knowing where I was going or why. The corridor ahead was bathed in a dim, flickering light that came from nowhere. As I moved, the shadows stretched and shifted, forming shapes and figures that seemed to watch me from the corners of my vision. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of movement, something small and fleeting, just out of sight, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The silence was broken only by the sound of my own footsteps and the soft, eerie whispers that seemed to echo from every direction. I kept my gaze fixed on the ground in front of me, afraid to look up for fear of what might be lurking in the darkness above. Then I saw it again. A door. This one was different. It wasn't the smooth, metallic door like the last one I had opened. It was an old, wooden door, its surface scratched and worn with age. The knob was rusted, the wood splintering in places. I approached it cautiously, my hand hovering near the handle, but something stopped me. The whispers had stopped. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was silence. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I had to open it. I grasped the knob, my fingers trembling as I turned it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a small, dimly lit room. At first, I thought it was another part of the endless corridor, but as I stepped through, I realized this was different. This room was normal. It was a room I recognized. My apartment. But it wasn't quite right. The walls were cracked, the furniture overturned, and there was a coldness in the air that didn't belong. The shadows in the corners of the room were deep and unnatural, as though they stretched far beyond the confines of the walls. I took a tentative step forward, my heart racing in my chest. And then I saw her. The woman from the window. She was standing in the far corner of the room, her back turned to me. Her hair was long and unkempt, her clothes torn and ragged. I could barely make out her features in the dim light, but I knew it was her. "I've been waiting for you," her voice echoed in my mind, though her lips didn't move. I froze, my body numb with fear. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The silence was suffocating, and the room seemed to close in around me, the walls tightening as if they were being drawn inward. And then I heard it. A door opening. It was behind me. I turned slowly, too afraid to move too quickly, and there it was. Another door, standing ajar in the middle of the room. The same metallic door I had seen before. I didn't have to open it to know what it led to. It was the corridor again. The same endless, shifting maze. The woman's voice returned, softer now. You can never leave. And with that, the room dissolved. The walls, the furniture, the woman, all of it faded away, leaving me alone in the corridor once more. The door behind me slammed shut, and I knew without a doubt that I was trapped. There was no escape. I had become a part of the maze, bound to it forever. The whispers resumed, louder than ever before, and the darkness closed in around me. I didn't scream. There was no point. The only thing left was to keep walking, one step after another, into the unknown. For there was no way out. Not anymore. It was an ordinary day. At least, it seemed ordinary at first. I had just come home from work, exhausted but grateful for the quiet evening ahead. As I opened the door, I noticed something unusual on the hallway floor, an envelope, crisp and white, with my name written in elegant, flowing handwriting. I hadn't been expecting anything. No bills, no letters, no parcels. Just the silence of a normal night. But the envelope felt out of place. My fingers hesitated as I picked it up, feeling the smooth texture of the paper. I turned it over, and there, on the back, was a wax seal. It was an old-fashioned touch, something I hadn't seen in years. I didn't recognize the symbol engraved on the wax, though. I could have left it unopened, ignored it, but something pulled at me. I felt a strange compulsion to open it. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. It was an invitation. The words were simple, yet chilling in their precision. You are invited to a gathering at 16 Oakwood Drive. 8 p.m. sharp. Come along. I frowned as I read the address. Oakwood Drive had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. The houses there had been empty for years, the street abandoned to time and nature. I had walked past it many times, and I had never seen a single soul there. So why would anyone send an invitation to a party there? And yet, as I stood in the quiet of my apartment, a strange pull grew inside me. It was almost as if someone, was calling me to go. I looked at the clock. It was already 7:30 p.m. The thought of going felt ridiculous. Unsafe. But the more I thought about it, the more the idea gripped me. I had to go. There was no reason, no logical explanation, but I knew that if I didn't, I would regret it. I found myself standing in front of the abandoned street shortly after 8 p.m. The houses loomed before me, dark and silent, their windows boarded up, their yards overgrown. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves in the wind. I paused at the corner of Oakwood Drive. The address on the invitation burned in my mind. There, at the end of the street, was the house. The house. It was large, old, and Gothic in appearance. The kind of house you see in horror movies, the kind that you wouldn't want to approach after dark. Its windows were dark, as though no one had lived there in decades, yet a faint light flickered through one of the upstairs windows. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but I couldn't turn back now. The invitation had led me here, and I wasn't going to let it go unanswered. I walked up the overgrown path to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was ajar. It shouldn't have been. I pushed the door open, and a sudden chill swept over me. The house was cold, much colder than it should have been. I stepped inside, the creaky wooden floor groaning under my feet. The room was dimly lit, a single chandelier hanging from the ceiling, its crystals reflecting the faint light. The walls were adorned with faded tapestries, and the air smelled of dust and decay. Everything looked forgotten. And yet, there was something strange about it all. The silence was oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A soft rustling sound came from upstairs. I froze. I had to go upstairs. With each step, the house seemed to grow louder, as if it were alive, reacting to my presence. The air grew thicker, the silence deeper. My breath quickened, but I couldn't stop. Something was drawing me upward, beckoning me toward the source of that sound. When I reached the top of the stairs, I found myself standing before a door at the end of the hallway. It was ajar, just like the front door. The same dim light spilled from the crack, casting long shadows along the walls. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling, and pushed it open. Inside, the room was empty, except for the figure standing by the window. A woman. She was dressed in an elegant gown, her back turned toward me. Her hair cascaded down her back in soft waves, and she stood perfectly still, as if waiting for me. I knew her. Or rather, I should have known her. But I couldn't place her face, and that terrified me more than anything. "You came," she said, her voice soft but clear. And before I could respond, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but the woman was gone. And in her place stood something else. Something far darker. The room was no longer the same. It had transformed, twisting into something grotesque. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the shadows in the corners shifted, taking shape. I could hear breathing, slow, deliberate, coming from every direction. And then, a voice whispered in my ear, low and cold. "You shouldn't have come." The door had been a trap, and now I was caught. I tried to move, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The room was closing in on me, the walls pressing forward with every breath I took. The air was thick with something suffocating, something unnatural, and the shadows seemed to move, crawling across the floor like dark, slithering creatures. I glanced around, my heart racing. The room I had entered moments ago was no longer the same. The elegant tapestries had disintegrated into tattered rags, the chandelier above had become a twisted mockery of its former self, and the cold, stale air now carried the scent of something rotten, like the decay of forgotten things. I stumbled backward, my eyes darting across the room in a desperate attempt to find some sort of escape. But the windows, once clear, were now obscured by an opaque fog, the streetlights outside barely visible through the mist. The door, my only way out, was no longer an option. It had been replaced by a massive stone archway, its surface covered in carvings that seemed to move as I watched, shifting like living shadows. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered again, only this time it seemed to echo from every corner of the room. I spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The woman who had been standing by the window was gone, leaving nothing but an oppressive silence in her wake. My breath quickened. The fear was crawling under my skin, scratching at my insides, urging me to turn and run. But I couldn't move. I felt like I was caught in a trap, like every choice I made, every step I took, was already preordained by something far beyond my understanding. The invitation had led me here, but it was no longer clear who or what had sent it, or why. I heard a soft rustling behind me, faint at first, like a whispering breeze. I turned quickly, but nothing was there. The silence returned, heavier than before. I tried to steady my breathing, to think clearly, but the pressure in the room was unbearable. I needed to leave, needed to get out before whatever this place was swallowing me whole. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt that leaving wasn't an option. The invitation had been a lure, a hook in my soul that I couldn't shake. Despite the growing terror, I felt an overwhelming urge to explore further, to find the answers hidden within this cursed place. "You came for a reason," the voice whispered again, now coming from above. I looked up. The ceiling had shifted, now resembling an intricate web of veins and cracks, pulsing with a sickly red light. The light didn't come from any source, it seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the house was alive, watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. "You can't leave," the voice said again, clearer this time. It was unmistakably human, but it held something ancient and wrong, something that made my skin crawl. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath in the cold, thin mist that had gathered in the air. I backed away slowly, instinctively moving toward the archway, hoping it might be my way out. But as I neared it, the air thickened, the pressure in my chest increasing. The closer I got, the more I could feel the weight of the walls closing in, their oppressive presence pressing against me from all sides. I hesitated. Was this another trap? Was I walking right into whatever nightmare had been waiting for me since the moment I stepped inside? But the invitation had been clear. I had to go. I had to follow the path, no matter how much it terrified me. Something deep inside me told me I would find answers, or at least a way to stop this, whatever this was. I reached out for the stone archway, my fingers trembling as I touched the cold surface. It was smooth, unnaturally so, and it felt like it was pulsing with some hidden energy, as if it were alive. I stepped forward, crossing the threshold. The air outside the archway was different, thick, heavy, like stepping into water. As soon as I passed through, the room seemed to collapse behind me. The sounds, the whispers, the rustling, faded into a deafening silence. I found myself standing in a new space, a long hallway that stretched far beyond the limits of the house. The walls were lined with portraits, their faces turned toward me, their eyes watching. I could feel the weight of their gaze, each one more intense than the last. The hall was dimly lit by flickering candlelight that cast unsettling shadows on the walls. I began walking, each step slow, deliberate, as though I was testing the ground beneath me. The farther I walked, the more I felt the presence of something behind me. It wasn't the same voice I had heard before, but the air had shifted, and something else was now following me. The footsteps were faint at first, like the sound of someone walking at a distance. But then they grew louder, more distinct, until they seemed to echo in perfect rhythm with my own. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. No one. Yet the footsteps continued, right behind me, as if they were a shadow, an echo of my own. I turned another corner, hoping for something familiar, but the hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, and the walls closed in tighter with each step. The atmosphere had changed again. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating, pressing against my eardrums. My heartbeat drummed in my chest, louder and louder, drowning out everything else. "Don't turn around." The voice came from behind me, low and hoarse, almost a hiss. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help myself. I spun around, and in that moment, I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the hallway. Its shape was indistinct, its form blurred, as though it were not quite real. But the eyes, those eyes were clear, and they were staring directly at me. I froze. I didn't know who or what it was, but the air seemed to crackle with its presence. "You came for a reason," it repeated, its voice now louder, clearer, carrying a weight of finality. I turned and ran. I sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps pounding against the wooden floor, but the sound of my feet was drowned out by the heavy thumping of something else, something behind me. Each step felt like a chase, as if I were running from a nightmare that I couldn't escape. The wall stretched, the floor seemed to shift under me, and I could hear whispers growing louder with every passing moment. The air was thick and suffocating, and the smell of decaying mixed with something metallic, like blood. I glanced over my shoulder again, heart racing, but there was nothing there. The hallway was still empty, save for the dark, oppressive shadows that twisted and lurked in the corners. I could feel the presence of something close, but each time I turned, I saw nothing. The hall seemed endless. No matter how fast I ran, it never seemed to end. The flickering candlelight from the walls was now casting grotesque, distorted shadows, each one more monstrous than the last. I tried to focus, to calm myself, but it was impossible. My breath was ragged, my body trembling with fear. Then, a door appeared. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I had passed this part of the hallway 100 times, and there had never been a door. But now, a dark wooden door stood at the end of the corridor, its edges lined with rusted iron, the handle a twisted, gnarly thing that looked as though it had never been touched. Something drew me to it. The whispers seemed to call me, urging me toward the door, telling me to open it. I knew, deep down, that I shouldn't. I knew that whatever was behind that door would not be anything I wanted to face. But the pull was irresistible, like an invisible hand wrapping around my chest, squeezing tighter with every passing second. I walked toward it, my body moving as if it had a will of its own. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, sharper, more insistent. They echoed in my ears, filling my head with their commands. Open it. The voice was unmistakable now, clear and demanding. I reached for the handle. My hand shook as I touched the cold, iron surface. The handle turned with a creak, the sound like bones grinding together. The door opened slowly, revealing a room that was almost completely dark, save for a single candle burning on a table in the center. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I jumped, spinning around, but it was too late to turn back now. The room was small, cramped, the walls lined with old, decaying furniture and dust-covered portraits. The candle flickered in the center of the room, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. I didn't want to be there. I knew I shouldn't have stepped inside, but I couldn't move. The air was thick, stifling, as though the room itself were alive, suffocating me. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the shadows began to shift. You should have stayed away. The voice was right behind me, a cold breath on my neck. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing. Just the flickering candlelight and the oppressive darkness that seemed to stretch out beyond it. I had to leave. I turned toward the door, but the room had changed again. The door was no longer there. The walls had shifted, and now, instead of the door I had come through, there was only a cold stone wall. I stumbled back, panic rising in my throat. I tried to claw at the walls, my fingers scraping against the rough stone, but it was useless. The room was now a prison, and I was trapped. You came for a reason, the voice whispered again, this time closer, its breath hot against my ear. I spun around, my eyes wide with terror, but there was no one. The room was empty, save for the shadows that now seemed to have formed. Dark, formless shapes loomed in the corners, creeping closer with every heartbeat. I backed away, my legs trembling beneath me. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows stretched longer, until they were consuming the room. The whispers became screams, deafening, filling my head with their sharp, cutting voices. And then, the light flickered. For a moment, the room was bathed in darkness, and I couldn't see anything at all. I couldn't even hear the whispers anymore. It was as though I had been completely swallowed by the silence. And then, the candle flared back to life. But the figure standing in front of me was not the same. It was a person, but not. Their face was a blur, a smudge of darkness, and their eyes were hollow, empty sockets, staring straight through me. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward me, and in that moment, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. I should never have opened that door. I should never have come here. And now, it was too late to turn back. The figure moved toward me, its steps slow and deliberate, and I backed away, my body frozen in terror. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows rising up around me like a tidal wave. I turned and ran, the figure still coming closer, the darkness swallowing everything in its path. I couldn't escape it. There was no way out. I was trapped in this house of nightmares, with no hope of ever leaving. And all I could hear was the voice. You came for a reason. And now, you'll never leave. I kept running, my breath coming in short, panic gasps, my hands scrambling against the stone walls for something, anything, to steady myself. But the more I ran, the longer the corridor stretched before me. The walls, once so familiar, now loomed as if they were alive, closing in on me with every step. The floor beneath my feet felt uneven, shifting and buckling like it was trying to swallow me whole. The figure was still there, following me, moving at its own slow, unnerving pace. It never sped up, never hurried, yet it was always right behind me. Every time I turned to look, its eyes, those hollow, empty sockets, seemed to draw closer, as if it was reading my fear, feeding off it. I reached a corner, my heart hammering, my head spinning, and I pressed myself against the wall, trying to catch my breath, but the darkness pressed in all around me. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices, each one a dagger to my sanity. They were laughing, mocking me, telling me that I couldn't escape. You can't run away from what's already inside you. The voice came again, this time colder, more malevolent. I looked down at my hands, and for the first time, I noticed something strange. My fingers were starting to fade, as if they were dissolving into the air. I rubbed them frantically, trying to make sense of it, but it only got worse. My body, my very existence, was beginning to slip away, like I was becoming part of the room itself. I staggered back, my panic rising to a new level. No! No, this can't be happening. I shouted, trying to anchor myself to something real, but the more I fought, the faster my form began to fade. The figure stopped in front of me. It was closer than ever, its form becoming more defined now. It was not human, not in any way I could recognize. Its skin was slick, like oil, and it had no features other than those dark, empty eyes, wide and unblinking. You shouldn't have come, it said, its voice a hiss that sent chills down my spine. It reached out slowly, the fingers elongated and gnarled, as if they were made from shadows themselves. I screamed, pushing myself against the wall, desperate to break free. But there was no escape. The room was changing again, the walls twisting and contorting like they were alive, wrapping around me. The shadows took form, not just the figure now, but shapes, figures, things that shouldn't have existed, creeping along the edges of my vision. The air became thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as if something invisible was pressing down on me. And then, the floor beneath me started to buckle, as if it was swallowing me whole. but walls were no longer walls. They were hands, cold, twisted hands reaching for me, pulling me down into the darkness. I felt a coldness seep into my very bones as the ground gave way beneath me. My legs gave out, and I fell, the void beneath me opening like the jaws of some ancient beast. The whispers grew louder, deafening. "You will be one of us," the figure said, its voice echoing in my mind. "You've always been here. And now you'll never leave." I tried to scream, but the darkness swallowed my voice, pulling me down into the cold, suffocating abyss. And then, nothing. I woke up. But it wasn't the relief I had hoped for. The room was gone. The hallway, the door, the shadows, they were all gone. I was back in my own apartment, sitting in my living room as if nothing had ever happened. The lamp on the table flickered, and I blinked, confused. Had it been a dream? But no, there, sitting on the coffee table, was the same invitation. The same dark, old paper. The same elegant handwriting. And beneath the familiar words, a new message had been added. "You're still invited." It started a few weeks ago. At first, it was just a sound, barely noticeable, but enough to stir something deep inside me. Every night, precisely at midnight, a knock would echo through the door. A sharp, deliberate knock. 3 raps, always the same rhythm. It became routine, something I knew would happen. Yet, every time, I would open the door to find nothing. Empty hallway. No one. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a neighbor playing some kind of prank. But there was something about it that felt wrong. The sound was too precise. Too intentional. I began to wonder who could be behind it. And why? The silence after each knock was deafening. I'd stand there, in the doorway, staring into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. But nothing came. No footsteps, no movement, just the sound of my own heartbeat, which seemed far too loud for the quiet of the night. One evening, as the clock ticked toward midnight, I found myself dreading the inevitable knock. It was like a countdown, each minute stretching longer than the last. I wasn't sure why, but that night felt different. The air around me seemed heavier, as if it were charged with something I couldn't name. I looked over at the clock once more, 11:59. The knock came. 1, 2, 3. It was louder than usual. A sharp, almost violent sound that echoed down the hall and reverberated through the walls. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't move, not at first. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the door. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. It had to be some sort of mistake, right? A miscommunication, a neighbor who forgot something, or maybe just a dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. This time, I didn't open the door. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath. I could feel my pulse in my neck, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Something was different. I wasn't sure if it was the knock itself or the way the silence afterwards seemed to stretch on forever. It was as if the world around me had stopped. Then, another sound. A faint scraping, almost like something, or someone, was moving outside my door. I held my breath, pressing my ear to the wood. It was too quiet now. There was no wind, no distant sounds of traffic. Just the odd scrape. Like nails on wood. I wanted to open the door, to step outside and see what it was, but fear rooted me to the spot. I couldn't explain it, but something told me that stepping outside would only lead to more questions. Questions I wasn't sure I wanted the answers to. The scraping stopped. In its place, I heard something far worse. A whisper. Low and faint, barely audible, but unmistakably there. The words were too soft to make out, but the tone, it sounded like a voice I should have known. A voice from the past. I leaned closer to the door, my hand gripping the knob so tightly my knuckles turned white. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from outside. No. It was coming from inside the apartment. The air felt thick, suffocating. I could barely breathe as the temperature in the room dropped, a chill creeping up my spine. I had to know. I had to open the door. And then, just as my fingers brushed the handle, the whisper stopped. For a brief moment, there was complete silence. A silence so profound it was almost oppressive. I looked down at the door. The sound of my breathing seemed far too loud in comparison. Then, without warning, I heard it again, louder now, clearer. The knock. 3 sharp raps, as if daring me to open the door. I didn't open the door this time. I couldn't. The sound of the knocking still echoed in my ears, but I remained frozen. My body felt as if it were rooted to the floor, as if the room itself were holding me hostage. For a long while, I simply stared at the door, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The silence stretched on, becoming unbearable. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the cold dread gnawing in my insides told me otherwise. After what felt like an eternity, I took a hesitant step back. My feet shuffled across the floor, making no sound, as if the room itself were trying to muffle my every movement. I needed to be sure. I needed to see what was behind that door. I glanced toward the clock. It was still midnight, but the hands on the face seemed to be moving slower now, as if time itself had decided to hold its breath. I stepped quietly toward the door, my pulse racing with each step. The closer I got, the more I could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. I placed my hand on the doorknob. It was cold, colder than I remembered, sending a chill straight through my fingers. For a moment, I hesitated. The rational part of me screamed to turn away, to retreat to the safety of my bed and pretend that nothing was happening. But the curiosity, no, the need to understand, overpowered everything else. I twisted the doorknob, the sound sharp in the silence. Nothing. I pulled the door open slowly, the hinges creaking as if protesting the movement. The hallway outside was dark, the shadows stretching longer than they should have been. There was no sign of anyone, no footsteps, no whispers, nothing. Just the emptiness of the corridor. But something felt off. I could sense it, a presence just out of sight, like the air itself was charged with an unseen force. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stepped into the hallway, my eyes scanning the darkness. It was eerily still, the kind of stillness that made every sound seem amplified. My breath echoed in the silence, and I quickly pulled the door shut behind me, the sound of it clicking into place sending a shock through my nerves. I was alone. Or so it seemed. But there was something wrong. The walls felt too close, as if they were closing in around me. The hallway stretched ahead, but it seemed to grow nearer with each step I took. The dim light from the overhead bulb flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that danced along the walls. And then, I heard it again. A soft sound, like a footstep, faint but unmistakable. It came from behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. The hallway was still, just as it had been before. Yet, the sound persisted, coming closer now. The soft scrape of something dragging along the floor, followed by the faintest shuffle of feet. I started to walk faster, my breath coming in shallow gasps, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I turned the corner at the end of the hallway, my footsteps quickening, but the sound of the scraping followed me. It was getting louder now. I could feel it closing in, like something was just behind me, gaining on me with every step I took. My mind raced, my thoughts a blur of confusion and panic. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. And then, in the dim light of the hallway, I saw it. A shadow, a figure, standing at the far end where the hallway twisted out of view. It didn't move. It just stood there, its outline barely visible in the flickering light. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound. It just stood, staring at me. And I knew, deep down, that it had been waiting for me. Waiting for me to step into the hallway, to walk closer, to see it. I took a step back, but my foot caught on something. I stumbled, my hands reaching out to steady myself, but the hallway seemed to stretch impossibly far, like it was pulling me toward the figure. The whispering began again, this time clearer. It was calling my name. The voice was familiar, but distorted. It sounded like someone I had known, someone from my past. But I couldn't remember who. The name slipped through my mind like water through my fingers, just out of reach. "Come closer," the voice whispered, each syllable curling around me like a cold breeze. I couldn't move. The figure remained in the distance, its presence overwhelming. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. The air grew colder, heavier. And then, it took a step forward. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unyielding. The figure in the distance moved, but it didn't walk like a person. It glided, hovering just above the floor, as if it wasn't fully bound to this world. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it draw closer, inch by inch, the darkness around it deepening with each passing second. The hallway seemed to warp around me, the walls bending inwards, closing me in. My heart pounded louder, the rhythm of it drowning out everything else. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my voice was lost in the suffocating silence. All I could do was watch as the figure came nearer. The whispering continued, now a steady murmur, repeating the same word over and over, like a chant. "Come." I shook my head, trying to force my legs to move, to run, but they wouldn't respond. My body felt paralyzed, trapped by the weight of whatever this thing was. I took a step back, but the figure didn't stop. It was getting closer, its form becoming clearer. It wasn't a person at all. It was a shape, a shadow that took on an eerie, human-like appearance. The longer I looked, the more it seemed to distort, its edges shifting like smoke in the wind. Its face was the worst part. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel its eyes, as if they were piercing through me. There was something wrong with them, empty, hollow, like black pits where life had once been. They were staring directly at me, and the weight of that gaze felt like it was crushing me. The whispering grew louder, now echoing in the very air around me. "Come to me." I wanted to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It was like a force was pulling me toward it, some invisible tether between us that I couldn't escape. The more I resisted, the stronger it became. I could feel the pull deep in my chest, as if my very soul were being drawn in. The figure moved closer still, until it was only a few feet away from me. I could almost feel the coldness radiating from it, an unnatural chill that made my skin prickle. Suddenly, the figure stopped. Its form froze in place, and the whispering ceased. For a long, unbearable moment, nothing happened. The silence was worse than anything else. I stood there, trembling, waiting for whatever came next, unable to look away. My mind was screaming for me to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. Then, the figure spoke. Its voice was like 1,000 voices layered over each other, distorted and broken. It wasn't speaking directly to me, but somehow, I understood every word. "Do you remember?" The question cut through the air, sharp and heavy. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, as if the very air had turned to ice. Remember what? I thought, panic rising in my chest. I didn't know. I couldn't know. But there was something familiar about the way the question hung in the air, something that gnawed at the edges of my memory. The figure took another step forward, and I flinched. It was so close now, its presence overwhelming. I could hear it breathing, or what I thought was breathing, a slow, ragged sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was as if the figure wasn't just one entity, but many, all wrapped into one horrifying shape. "Do you remember us?" The words were cold, unfeeling, and they echoed in my mind like a warning. I couldn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to grasp at something, anything, that would make sense of this nightmare. The figure's presence was suffocating, and I could feel my thoughts slipping away, swallowed by the emptiness that surrounded it. It reached out, its hand stretching toward me. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel the air around it, thick and suffocating, as if it were drawing in everything, light, sound, hope. And then, just as its hand was about to touch me, the ground beneath me shifted. I stumbled, disoriented, my vision spinning. The figure's hand halted midair, as if something had interrupted it. The hallway, the shadows, the figure, everything seemed to tremble, as if the world itself was about to collapse. I blinked, trying to steady myself, but when my eyes opened, the hallway was different. It was no longer the narrow corridor I had been standing in. The walls were now covered in cracks, like they were decaying before my very eyes. The lights flickered erratically, casting twisted shadows on the floor. The figure was still there, but it was no longer just one shape. It was multiplying, splitting into smaller, indistinct forms, each one as terrifying as the last. The whispering began again, louder than before, a cacophony of voices calling to me, drowning out my thoughts. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. Whatever this was, whatever this thing was, it wasn't something that belonged in this world. And it was getting closer. I had to get away. I turned and ran. I ran blindly, my feet pounding against the floor, the sound echoing in my ears like a drumbeat of terror. The hallway stretched on, impossibly long, bending in ways that defied logic. Each step I took seemed to pull me deeper into the darkness, as if the very walls were conspiring to keep me here, to trap me with the thing that was following me. I could hear it now, the figure, or the figures, I wasn't sure anymore, moving in pursuit. Their footsteps were not like mine, they were heavier, dragging, like something that didn't quite belong in this world. Each footstep felt like it was getting closer, the sound growing louder, until it seemed to be all around me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart racing, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down, not even for a moment. I didn't know what would happen if I did. The shadows were closing in, creeping along the walls, distorting the space around me. The flickering lights overhead cast twisted silhouettes, making it impossible to know what was real and what wasn't. The whispering grew louder, the voices all blending together in a maddening chorus. I turned a corner, but the hallway didn't end. It just twisted, a loop of never-ending darkness. I had no idea where I was going anymore, or if there was even a way out. Every time I looked back, the figure, the shadow, seemed to be closer, just out of reach, but always there, its presence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I kept running, my legs burning with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. Not until I was out of here, not until I was far away from whatever this was. But then, just as I thought I might collapse, something changed. The air shifted. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I could feel it, a thick, oppressive presence that was more than just the figure behind me. Something else had entered the hallway. I stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the end of the hallway, a door appeared. I hadn't seen it before, but now it was there, standing in the distance like a lifeline. A door, a way out, or at least the illusion of one. The whispers grew louder, desperate, as if urging me to stay, to turn around and face the thing behind me. But I didn't care anymore. I couldn't. I ran toward the door, my body moving on pure instinct. The closer I got, the more I felt the presence behind me, closing in like a storm. I could hear its heavy, dragging steps, its unnatural breath, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I grabbed the handle. It was cold, so cold that it sent a jolt of pain up my arm, but I didn't hesitate. I threw it open. The moment I stepped through, the hallway disappeared. I stumbled into a different space, a room unlike anything I had seen before. It was vast, empty, and dark, but not in the same oppressive way as the hallway. This darkness was vast, open, as if the space stretched out infinitely in all directions. It felt like no room I had ever been in, as if it existed outside of time and place. I looked around, disoriented, trying to catch my breath. The door slammed shut behind me, but there was no sound. I turned around quickly, but there was no sign of the hallway, no sign of the figure or whatever had been chasing me. I was alone. Or so I thought. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence, so quiet at first that I wasn't sure I heard it. Not yet. The words echoed around me, though I couldn't tell where they came from. They weren't like the whispers before, they weren't pleading or manipulative, they were calm, almost patient. But they sent a new wave of dread through me. I turned in a circle, looking for any sign of movement, but I was still alone in the dark room. My breath was coming in short, sharp bursts, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. Then, I saw it. At the far end of the room, a faint light began to glow. At first, it was just a pinprick, a soft, flickering glow in the darkness. But it grew, slowly, until it illuminated a small space ahead of me. The light was soft and cold, like moonlight, but it felt unnatural. As if it didn't belong here. I walked toward it, my steps hesitant, unsure whether to approach or turn away. The closer I got, the more I felt that familiar presence again, just behind me, in the corners of my mind. The thing was still there, lurking, watching. The light in front of me grew stronger, until I could make out shapes within it. Shadows, shifting and moving like they were alive. The shapes seemed to form a doorway, an entrance to another space, another world, perhaps. But as I stepped closer, something inside me screamed to stop. There was something wrong about it, something too familiar. The room, the hallway, the figure, the whispers, it was all part of the same thing, the same twisted nightmare that had been following me. I was being drawn in, but this time I wasn't sure I could escape. As I reached the light, I heard the whisper again, louder now, clear and unmistakable. Come. And with it, I felt the cold fingers of dread wrap around my chest. I stood at the edge of the glowing doorway, the light pulsing like a heartbeat, drawing me in with an undeniable force. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, beautiful, cold, and alien, all at once. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn and leave this place behind. But something inside me, something deep and primal, urged me to step forward, to move toward the light, to see what lay beyond it. The whispers were louder now, no longer just voices in the distance, but a chorus filling the room. They were beckoning me, calling my name with an intensity that felt suffocating. Come, come. I could feel the weight of their words pressing on me, pulling me closer to the threshold. My heart raced in my chest, each beat faster than the last. My thoughts were a blur, my mind teetering on the edge of panic and curiosity. I knew I had to choose. I had to make a decision now, before the choice was taken from me. Behind me, the room was dark, empty, silent. But I knew what waited there. I had felt it. The shadows, the presence, the oppressive weight of the thing that had been chasing me. The figure had been nothing more than a manifestation of something far older, far more powerful, and it wasn't done with me yet. I turned back toward the doorway. The light shone brighter now, bathing the room in an ethereal glow. For a moment, I saw faces within it, familiar faces, faces of people I had known, lost, forgotten. They stared at me, their eyes hollow, their lips frozen in silent screams. I recoiled, my hand instinctively reaching toward the cold stone wall beside me, as if seeking something solid to hold on to. The faces faded, but their presence lingered in the air like a faint, mournful echo. Come to us, they seemed to whisper. I clenched my eyes shut, trying to block out the voices. But I couldn't. They were everywhere, and it was all too much. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if it were filled with shadows themselves, pressing in from all sides. And then, a voice, distinct and separate from the others, cut through the chaos. Run. It was my own voice. But it wasn't coming from me. It was a voice that felt both foreign and familiar, a warning, a plea, coming from somewhere deep within my mind. The voice of reason, the voice of survival. I took a shaky breath and turned away from the glowing doorway, my mind racing with the consequences of my decision. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to escape, to leave this place and never look back. But I couldn't forget the faces, the whispers. They wouldn't let me. I stepped toward the light again. The instant I crossed the threshold, everything changed. The room dissolved around me, and I was falling, spiraling through a void that seemed to stretch on forever. The coldness was gone, replaced by an intense, searing heat, as if I were plunging into the heart of a fire. The walls, the floor, the air, everything had become fluid, shifting, alive. I was no longer in control of my body, my thoughts, my movements. Something else was guiding me, pulling me deeper into the unknown. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. There was no air, no ground, no sense of time. Only the endless descent. Then, in an instant, everything stopped. I landed hard, my knees buckling as I hit the ground. The impact left me breathless, disoriented. I blinked, trying to clear the spots from my vision. The world around me was silent, still. For a moment, I couldn't tell where I was, or even what was real. I was outside, but not outside in the way I knew. The sky above me was a dark, swirling massive clouds, shifting and turning with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The landscape stretched out in all directions, an endless expanse of barren, rocky terrain. No trees. No houses. No signs of life. It was as if I had been transported to another world, a place where time didn't exist, where reality itself was distorted. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. I tried to steady myself, but the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. The air was heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. There were no sounds here, no birds, no wind, no rustling of leaves. Just the oppressive silence, pressing in from all sides. I turned in a circle, searching for something, anything, that could help me make sense of this place. But there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of stone and dust. And then, I saw it. At the far edge of the horizon, a figure stood. A shadow against the swirling sky. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could feel it watching me. The same presence, the same feeling of being observed, just like before. It was waiting for me. I wasn't alone. I had made my choice. And now, there was no turning back. I started to walk toward the figure, my steps slow and deliberate. Each step felt like I was sinking deeper into the ground, as if the earth itself were trying to pull me back. But I kept moving, the figure drawing closer with each passing second. And when I reached it, when I finally came face to face with whatever it was, I realized something. This wasn't an escape. It wasn't freedom. It was just the beginning. Have you ever looked into a mirror and felt something wasn't right? A small shift, a flicker of movement just beyond the corner of your eye? I never used to believe in that sort of thing. Until I moved into the new apartment. It wasn't a fancy place, just a small, one-bedroom unit tucked away on the top floor of an old building. The kind of place you could afford if you were just starting out, or if you were running from something. I wasn't running from anything, not exactly. But after the breakup and the endless shuffle of trying to find somewhere that felt like mine, this apartment was supposed to be the fresh start I needed. But from the moment I set up the mirror, things began to change. It was an old, full-length mirror I found at a second-hand shop. The frame was dark wood, a little chipped, but it had character. It seemed like a good fit for the small hallway that led into the living room. At first, it was just a regular mirror. I'd glance into it, adjust my hair, check my outfit before I left. But slowly, I started to notice odd things. It wasn't even the big things that caught my attention at first. It was small, subtle. Shadows in the reflection that didn't match what was happening in the room. At first, I thought it was just the lighting. The apartment was poorly lit, the bulb in the hallway flickering at odd intervals. I would shrug it off, but the odd shadows didn't stop. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something odd in the mirror. A dark shape moved across the edge of the frame. I paused. My heart skipped a beat. The hallway behind me was empty. I was alone in the room. I turned around quickly, expecting to see a shadow cast by the light, but there was nothing there. Just the darkened corner of the hallway. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the shadows in the hallway were playing tricks on my eyes. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that mirror. The next few days, the oddities grew. The shadows became more distinct, more deliberate. They would dart across the reflective surface when I wasn't looking, always just out of my direct line of sight. They were fleeting, but they were there. I'd catch glimpses of them, and then they'd be gone. I started to feel like I was being watched, but whenever I turned around, there was no one there. It was one quiet evening, just before dusk, when I saw it for the first time, the figure. I had just come back from the grocery store and was putting things away in the kitchen. I felt the usual heaviness in the air, the strange tension that always seemed to hang in the apartment. As I placed a can of beans on the counter, I glanced at the mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then my eyes widened as I saw it. In the reflection, there was a figure standing in the hallway. But when I turned around, the hallway was empty. The figure in the mirror didn't match anything in the room. It was just a shadow, a dark, formless shape that seemed to hover at the edge of the frame. I couldn't make out its details, but I could sense it, somehow. It was watching me. My heart raced. I turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone, replaced by the usual stillness. I stepped closer to the glass, inspecting every inch, every corner, every reflection. Nothing. It was as if the figure had never been there at all. I tried to brush it off. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. "Just a trick of the light." But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a trick. That night, I tried to sleep, but every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, made my skin crawl. The apartment seemed louder than usual, more alive with the whispers of the night. I kept thinking of the figure, the dark shape in the mirror, and I couldn't get it out of my mind. Eventually, I fell asleep, exhausted, but the nightmares began. In my dream, I was standing in front of the mirror, just like I had in the waking world. But this time, the reflection was different. I wasn't alone. The shadow was there again, but this time it wasn't a distant figure. It was close. So close, I could feel its presence, its coldness. It pressed against the glass, just inches from my face, as though it wanted to come through, to reach out and touch me. I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside my window. I sat up in bed, staring at the mirror across the room. The glass was still and quiet, reflecting only the faint outline of the hallway. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I needed to know what was happening. I couldn't keep ignoring it. I had to confront the mirror. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked toward the hallway. The mirror was waiting, silent, like an obedient servant. But there was no mistaking the chill that swept through me as I stood in front of it. The reflection seemed darker, as if the glass itself were pulling me in. I took a deep breath, staring at my own reflection for a moment. It was just me, just my tired eyes and disheveled hair. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, I saw it. A movement just behind me. Something dark shifted in the reflection. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. Nothing there. I looked back at the mirror. And then, I saw it clearly, a figure, standing just behind me in the reflection. Its shape was clearer now, its edges sharper. It was tall, with long, jagged limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. The figure stepped closer. I could feel my heart racing, my breath shallow. The air around me grew thick, heavy, as if something was pressing against me from all sides. It was no longer just a shadow in the mirror. It was real. My breath caught in my throat as the figure in the mirror moved again. This time, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't just a trick of the light or a passing reflection. It was alive. I could see the distortion in the glass as it shifted, its form growing clearer with each movement, like it was trying to reach out and touch me. I stepped back, my feet unsteady, but the reflection didn't stop. The figure's long, spindly fingers stretched towards me, its face still hidden in shadow. The more I looked at it, the more I felt my stomach churn with an unnatural unease. It wasn't the way the figure looked that terrified me, it was the way it moved, slow and deliberate, as if it were waiting for something. Waiting for me. I quickly turned around, my eyes darting across the empty hallway, but there was nothing there. Just the same dimly lit corridor, the walls silent. But the feeling of being watched remained thick and oppressive. I glanced back at the mirror. The figure was closer now, its dark form filling more of the glass. The reflection had become warped, like the mirror was no longer just reflecting the room but something else, something that didn't belong here. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew I had to act. But what was I supposed to do? I had always been skeptical of the supernatural. Growing up, I dismissed any ghost stories as nothing more than urban legends, the stuff of overactive imaginations. But standing here now, facing a reflection that wasn't my own, I felt an undeniable chill crawl up my spine. The figure's hand pressed flat against the mirror, just inches away from me. I gasped, instinctively taking another step back. The air around me felt thicker now, the silence pressing down on my chest. My mind was racing. What is this? What does it want? I reached out, my trembling fingers brushing against the cold surface of the mirror. For a moment, nothing happened. The glass was just that, glass, cold and smooth beneath my fingertips. But as I pulled my hand away, something strange happened. A faint crack ran along the surface of the mirror, just beneath the shadowed figure's hand. It was as if the reflection had been altered by my touch. The crack spread slowly, like the surface of the mirror was alive, reacting to my presence. I recoiled, my pulse racing as the air grew heavier, colder. A low hum began to vibrate through the room, barely perceptible, but undeniable. It was coming from the mirror, the source of that strange, unsettling energy. I backed away, my feet shuffling on the cold wooden floor, but my gaze remained locked on the glass. The figure's face was now visible, though it was still shrouded in darkness. Its eyes gleamed, bright and unblinking, but its features remained indistinct. I couldn't quite make out its shape, but I could feel its malevolent presence, like it was pressing against the boundaries of the reflection, trying to break free. It was like the mirror was becoming too small to contain it. Suddenly, the hum grew louder, and the crack in the mirror expanded further. The reflection began to ripple, like a pool of water disturbed by an unseen force. I felt the ground beneath me tremble as the air became charged with an eerie energy. My body went cold, my hands trembling as I reached out again, this time almost involuntarily. Before I could stop myself, my fingers brushed the mirror's surface once more. This time, the crack grew faster, spidering across the entire surface of the glass. A low, deep growl echoed from within the mirror, sending a jolt of fear through my veins. I pulled my hand back, panic setting in. But it was too late. The figure in the reflection moved, not in the slow, deliberate way it had before, but with sudden, violent force. It slammed against the glass, pressing its face right up to the surface. Its eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt a surge of terror unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I turned away from the mirror, stumbling backward. My mind was racing. I needed to get out of the room. I needed to escape before whatever this thing was could reach me. But no matter how far I moved, the feeling of being trapped, of being cornered, didn't fade. The air felt suffocating, as if the space around me was closing in. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't keep looking at the mirror, at the reflection that wasn't just a reflection anymore. I rushed for the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but as I reached for the handle, something stopped me. A chill, a coldness that swept over me like a wave. I turned back toward the mirror, my heart sinking as I realized it wasn't the reflection anymore. The figure was standing in the doorway. It was real. I could see its shape now, more clearly than ever before. Its elongated limbs, its dark form, its face still hidden in shadow. But I could feel it, its presence was undeniable, suffocating. It was no longer confined to the mirror. It had crossed over. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. My legs were frozen, my throat tight with fear. The figure took a step forward, and the air around me grew colder, impossibly so. My breath fogged in front of me as I stared at it, unable to look away. I had to fight. I had to do something. But as I reached for the door again, something whispered, low, almost inaudible, but I heard it clear as day. "You're mine now." The voice was chilling, hollow, as if it came from the depths of the mirror itself. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure lunged. I didn't have time to react. The figure was on me in an instant. Its long, twisted arms reached out with inhuman speed, wrapping around my body in a grip that felt like ice, like it was squeezing the life out of me. I gasped, my lungs frozen, and for a split second, I couldn't breathe. I was trapped, held by something that shouldn't exist, something beyond the boundaries of reason. The shadow pressed closer, its form shifting and warping in ways that didn't make sense, its features still obscured by darkness. I couldn't focus on anything but the coldness radiating from its touch. It felt like every inch of my skin was being burned by an unnatural frost. My hands clawed at its arms, trying to break free, but it was like fighting a wall of ice. Nothing I did had any effect. "Let go of me!" I screamed, my voice breaking. But the shadow only tightened its hold, pulling me closer. The air around us grew colder, the temperature plummeting in a way that couldn't be explained. The room felt like it was freezing from the inside out, as if the very fabric of reality was bending. And then I felt it, its presence, overwhelming and oppressive, pushing into my mind. It wasn't just physical anymore. It was everywhere, a weight on my chest, suffocating, pressing against my thoughts. The voice from the mirror whispered again, this time clearer, louder, echoing in my head. "You cannot escape." I fought against the voice, pushing it away, but it was everywhere. It was inside me. My heart raced, my thoughts scattered. I had to get out. I had to break free. The mirror, the figure, it was all connected. I realized that somehow, I had to sever that connection. I had to destroy the mirror. But how? I racked my brain, my panic rising, as the figure continued to pull me closer, its cold, shadowy form now practically enveloping me. My body trembled, my muscles weak from the pressure. The whispering voice filled my mind again, growing louder with each passing second. "Give in. It's too late for you." No. I refused. I had to fight. I couldn't let this thing take me. I thought back to the crack in the mirror, the way it had started to distort the reflection, the way it had changed. I realized that if the figure had crossed over from the mirror into the physical world, then it was the mirror that held the key to stopping it. I had to destroy it. Now, with all the strength I had left, I pushed against the figure's grip. It was like trying to break free from a vice, but my mind clung to the idea of the mirror. The cracked surface. The figure trapped inside. "Get away from me!" I screamed, my voice raw, my arms flailing in desperation. The figure hissed, its presence growing more violent, more insistent, as if it could feel my resistance. I twisted and kicked, my foot finding its mark against the figure's torso. It recoiled for a moment, its grip loosening just enough for me to break free. Without thinking, I darted toward the hallway, my legs still shaky, my breath ragged, and my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't look back. I bolted straight for the living room. My eyes locked on the mirror, the dark, warped glass that had become the source of all this nightmare. I couldn't waste any more time. I had to shatter it. Now, with a cry of desperation, I grabbed the closest object I could find, a heavy lamp, and swung it with all my strength at the mirror. The lamp hit the glass with a sickening crack, but the mirror didn't shatter. Instead, the glass seemed to ripple, warping under the impact, like it was alive, like it was trying to fight back. The air thickened again. The low hum from before returned, vibrating through the room. The figure in the reflection grew larger, its face now almost fully visible, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, its mouth opening in a silent scream. I didn't stop. I swung again, harder this time, the lamp's base shattering against the glass. A loud crack echoed through the room, and the mirror began to splinter. The figure let out a sound that sent a chill through my bones, a low growl, almost as if it were enraged. But I didn't care. I couldn't stop now. With one final, desperate swing, the mirror shattered. The shards of glass exploded in all directions, raining down in sharp fragments, but the figure didn't disappear. Instead, it screeched, a sound so loud, so terrible, that it made my skin crawl. The room seemed to tremble as if the very walls were shaking from the force of the sound. I stumbled backward, covering my ears, but it didn't stop. The figure was still there, still in the room, though now it was no longer confined to the mirror. It was free. For a moment, the room was silent. The figure had vanished, but the air was thick with the remnants of its presence, a palpable heaviness that pressed in on me from all sides. My heart was still racing, my body trembling with the aftermath of the terror I had just experienced. I couldn't breathe. I looked down at the shattered pieces of glass scattered across the floor, each one reflecting a small, distorted image of the room. I had done it. I had broken the mirror. But somehow, I knew it wasn't over. The figure was still there, somewhere, lurking in the shadows, waiting. As I stared at the shards, a single piece caught my eye. It was a small fragment, jagged and sharp, with the faintest reflection of my face, except that my reflection was smiling back at me. And I wasn't smiling. In that moment, I knew I hadn't escaped. Not really. The mirror had broken, but the thing inside it had found a way to stay. And now, it was with me. It had followed me into the real world. And there was no going back. I didn't know how much time had passed after the mirror shattered. It felt like an eternity had stretched out between the moment the glass exploded and the silence that followed. My body was still frozen in place, my mind trying to grasp what had just happened. I could hear my own ragged breaths, but everything else seemed muffled, distant, like the world had been swallowed by the same darkness that filled the room. The reflection, the thing in the mirror, it hadn't been destroyed. It had followed me. I slowly rose to my feet, my legs unsteady, my gaze locked on the shards scattered across the floor. The weight of it pressed on me like an invisible force, the air thick with the lingering presence of that thing. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. My eyes scanned the room, every corner, every shadow. But it was still, too still. And then, a whisper. I froze. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. The same voice, the same cold tone, like it had come from somewhere deep within my mind. Don't think you've won. I spun around, my heart slamming against my chest. The room was empty. Nothing. But the whisper, it was still there, vibrating in the air, filling every corner of my thoughts. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, the cold screen feeling like a lifeline. I needed to talk to someone, anyone. I needed to know I wasn't losing my mind. I dialed the first number that came to mind, Claire. She was the closest thing to a friend I had in this city. She had visited a few times since I moved in, but I hadn't told her about the strange things that had been happening. I couldn't, not without sounding insane. But now I didn't care. I needed her help. I needed to hear a human voice. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Hey, are you okay? Claire's voice crackled through the line, thick with concern. I swallowed hard, fighting the rising panic. Claire, something's wrong. I don't know how to explain it. But I need you to come over. Please. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Okay, calm down. I'm on my way. Just breathe, all right? I'll be there soon. I hung up, my hand shaking. As I stood there in the middle of the room, the silence felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the shadows, just out of sight, waiting. I wanted to run, to leave, but I couldn't leave. Not until I figured out what was happening, not until I understood what had crossed over from the mirror. My gaze drifted to the shattered pieces of glass on the floor. Each shard reflected fragments of the room, distorted like tiny windows into some other reality. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning each piece carefully. That's when I saw it again. One of the shards reflected something different. It wasn't just a room. It was me, standing there, but the reflection wasn't right. My eyes were wide, my face twisted into an expression I didn't recognize. It was a distorted version of myself, smiling, a slow, twisted grin that didn't belong to me. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I looked closer. The reflection was wrong. The shadows in it moved differently, as if they had a life of their own. The smile widened. I stumbled backward, gasping for air. No, I whispered to myself. This isn't happening. The reflection in the shard didn't stop. It followed me, every movement I made. It was like it was alive, an extension of something that shouldn't be. And then, the whisper again. Come closer. The voice was no longer just in my mind. It was in the room, filling the air around me, as if the very walls were breathing. I turned, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive silence and the growing sense of dread. I wasn't alone. I heard the door to the apartment open. Hello? Claire's voice echoed from the hallway. I turned towards the sound, relief flooding me for a moment. But then I froze. The reflection in the glass, it was different now. It wasn't just following me anymore. It was moving, stretching its limbs, twisting, as if it were stepping out of the shard itself. I blinked, and it was closer. The door to the apartment creaked open wider. Claire stepped into the room, her eyes immediately falling on me. Her expression was a mixture of confusion and concern. "Are you all right?" "You look pale," she said, walking toward me. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. All I could do was stare at the shard of glass in front of me, where the reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was a presence, a thing that was coming through, pulling itself out of the mirror into the physical world. "Claire!" I finally managed to shout. "Get out of here. Get out of the apartment." Claire stopped, her face creasing in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "It's just a..." I couldn't finish the sentence. I could feel the shadow growing stronger, its form stretching out, its twisted limbs reaching towards us. The air was thickening again, growing colder, as if the room itself was becoming a part of the thing in the mirror. The figure was stepping out, its shape becoming more distinct with each passing second. Claire's eyes widened as she noticed the change in the room, her gaze flicking from me to the glass shards on the floor. What is happening?" But before I could warn her, the whisper came again, this time louder, clearer, almost mocking. "Welcome home." And then, the figure lunged. The figure lunged with a speed that defied reason. It was as if it had been waiting for this moment, stretching itself across the room with unnatural grace. Its shadowy form twisted and curled, its eyes glowing with a sickening light as it reached toward Claire and me. I could see its hands, long, jagged fingers, stretching further than they should have, reaching for our throats, our skin, anything it could grasp. "Run!" I screamed, pushing Claire back with all my strength. The moment my hands made contact with her, I felt a shock ripple through me, as if the air itself was charged with static. But I didn't hesitate. I grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the door. We had to get out of here, had to get far away from this thing. But just as I turned toward the hallway, I heard it. The sound of shuffling, of something dragging across the floor. I turned, and there it was again, the figure, its limbs now fully extended, its body rising from the shadows, no longer contained by the shattered glass. It was taller than before, impossibly tall, its form twisting and bending as it seemed to tear itself from the walls, as if it was made from the very space between reality and nightmare. "Get out!" I shouted to Claire again, my voice hoarse with panic. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I pulled Claire with me, our footsteps pounding on the hardwood floor, but the figure was right behind us, its footsteps too heavy, too deliberate. Each step it took sent vibrations through the floor, like the sound of thunder, a low hum that grew louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. The hallway seemed endless as we ran, the door to the outside just ahead. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not with that thing so close behind us. I could feel it, its presence so strong that it seemed to cling to the air around me, suffocating every breath I took. As we reached the door, I slammed my hand against the handle, pulling it open with desperate urgency. But as the door creaked open, the air in front of us seemed to shift. It was as if something invisible was pushing against it, blocking us from escaping. "No!" I cried, yanking at the handle with all my strength. But it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck. I turned toward Claire, panic flooding my veins. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't speak. She couldn't. She was frozen, staring at the figure now moving toward us, its shadow stretching across the floor, its form becoming clearer with each passing second. It was too close. I couldn't breathe. It was happening again, the same oppressive pressure, the same suffocating feeling. I felt its coldness on my skin, the icy fingers of fear crawling down my spine. It was right there, so close I could almost reach out and touch it. But I couldn't. My body refused to move. And then the whisper came again. "Stay with me." I screamed, turning toward the door again, slamming my shoulder against it, hoping to break it down. My muscles screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't just wait for it to take us. Not again. Not after everything. Crash. The door broke open. The world outside was a blur of night air and city lights, but I didn't care. I ran. I dragged Claire with me, pulling her through the door, out into the street, my legs moving faster than they ever had before. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We kept running, through the streets, past dark buildings and quiet alleyways, until my legs gave out. We collapsed onto the sidewalk, breathless and trembling. I didn't know how far we had gone, how long we had been running, but it didn't matter. I felt the coldness receding, somewhat, as if the thing had retreated, unable to follow us beyond the confines of the apartment. For a moment, we just lay there, gasping for air, the reality of what had just happened beginning to sink in. Claire's hands were shaking as she reached for me, her face pale with fear. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. I shook my head, my thoughts still a blur. "I don't know. It's not gone. I thought I broke it. I thought I got rid of it." The words felt hollow, as if I was trying to convince myself more than Claire. Because deep down, I knew the truth. That thing wasn't gone. It might have left the apartment, but it wasn't gone. It had followed us. It had crossed over from the mirror, and now it was with us, in the world, in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment. I stood, my knees weak, and helped Claire to her feet. "We can't go back," I said quietly. "We can't go back to the apartment." Claire nodded, her eyes filled with the same fear I felt. "Where do we go then?" I looked up at the night sky, the stars barely visible behind the smog and lights of the city. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the corner of my eye, moving in the shadows. A figure. A shape that wasn't quite right. I blinked, and it was gone. But I knew that it was still there. And no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would always be watching, waiting. It had followed me. And this was only the beginning. The end was coming. I don't know if you've ever felt like you're being watched. Not in the obvious way, where someone is following you, making their presence known. I mean the kind of feeling that starts with a soft, almost imperceptible shift in the air. The kind that makes your hair stand on end when you're alone. That's how it starts for me, every time I walk home. It's not a strange place. I live in a small neighborhood, quiet streets lined with old trees, familiar faces, and the kind of peace that you think will never be disturbed. But for the last few weeks, I've felt it, someone's footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe the stress of work was catching up with me. Maybe I was overthinking things. But then, the sound grew clearer. And that's when I realized I wasn't imagining it. Every night, as I walked home, the footsteps would follow me. They were always just a step behind, never getting closer but never fading away. It wasn't as if someone was walking in sync with me. No, It was different. It was as though the steps were echoing my own, a little too perfectly, a little too deliberately. I would glance behind me, and there would be nothing. Just the empty street, bathed in the soft light of the street lamps. The first few times, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But then, it happened again. And again. The sound of footsteps, always there, always in sync with my own. I could feel the unease building inside me. I told myself it was just nerves. But even then, I knew something was off. It wasn't natural. It wasn't a trick of the mind. It was real. One evening, I decided to test it. I walked down the street, keeping my steps steady, my heart pounding with every footfall. I waited for the sound to follow, for the soft echo to reach my ears. It came, and then I stopped. I stood perfectly still, my breath held in the cool air. The footsteps continued, mimicking my own. But when I turned around, there was nothing. Just the dark, empty street behind me. Nothing but the silence of the night. I didn't feel alone anymore. It felt like there was someone there, hidden in the shadows, waiting, watching. That's when I made the decision. I would set up cameras. I knew it was a bit extreme, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. If I could just capture it on film, I would have proof. Proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The next evening, I placed 3 cameras along the path I usually walked. One by the corner of the street, another near the old oak tree that stood like a sentry in the middle of the block, and the last one by my own front door. I wanted to know what was happening I couldn't see. The following morning, I checked the footage. At first, it seemed normal. My footsteps echoed against the pavement, just like always. The cameras caught everything, my walking, my pauses, my glances over my shoulder. But then, something strange started happening. The footage showed me walking, as expected, but there was something else, too. A shadow. A shadow that wasn't mine. It was faint at first, barely noticeable. But as the camera panned to the corner where I had stopped earlier, the shadow grew clearer. It wasn't just a shadow of me, nor was it a trick of the light. It was something else. I watched in growing horror as the shadow followed me perfectly, mimicking my every move. But there was one thing that stood out. When I stopped, the shadow kept moving. It didn't wait. It kept walking even after I had paused. And when I turned to look behind me in the video, the shadow was still there. But this time, it wasn't attached to me. It had form. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the footage again and again, each time seeing the shadow take a clearer, more defined shape. It wasn't just a vague blur. It looked like a figure, tall, hunched, with limbs that were too long, too thin. It moved in jerky motions, like it didn't belong in the same world I did. I felt my heart racing, my skin crawling with the realization that I had been followed by something I couldn't see, something I couldn't explain. But the worst part came next. The last camera, the one by my front door, showed something different. As I walked toward it, the shadow grew more aggressive. It didn't just follow me anymore. It shifted in the video, becoming more pronounced, more alive. By the time I reached the door, it was right behind me, so close I could feel its presence, hear its breathing, almost, though there was nothing there. I froze, staring at the screen. I could see my own reflection, my face pale with terror. But behind me? The shadow. It stood still for a moment, its form clearer than ever, and then it reached out, slowly, deliberately, as if it were touching me. I couldn't look away. My body was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to escape what I was seeing. It wasn't just following me anymore. It was waiting for me. I don't know what it wanted or why it had started following me in the first place. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone anymore. I never had been. I couldn't tell if it was the shadow of something supernatural or if it was something far more terrifying, something human but twisted beyond recognition. All I knew was that it had found me. And now it was watching, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows. But I knew that moment would come soon. And when it did, I wasn't sure I'd be able to survive it. The next few days passed in a haze, as if I were trapped in a dream I couldn't wake up from. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen on the footage. The shadow, how it seemed so real, so alive. It didn't feel like something from this world. And yet, it was real. I knew that for certain. I had proof now, but it only made things worse. The sense of being watched became unbearable. I couldn't go anywhere without feeling its eyes on me. Every time I stepped outside, I could almost hear it following, its footsteps just behind me, faint but unmistakable. Sometimes, when I glanced over my shoulder, I could almost see its silhouette just beyond the corner of my vision. But when I turned around, nothing was there. At night, I'd lock all the doors, check the windows, and then double-check again, as if somehow doing it twice would keep whatever was stalking me at bay. But the fear never left. It was like a constant pressure in my chest, squeezing tighter with each passing hour. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, that I was imagining things, that I had become obsessed with the shadow and the sound of footsteps. But deep down, I knew better. The footage was undeniable. I had to know more. The next evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't just sit around and wait for whatever this thing was to make its move. I needed answers, even if they scared me more than anything I had ever known. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through the footage again, focusing on the part where the shadow had touched me, or at least seemed to. My finger hovered over the screen, zooming in on the frame where the figure's hand appeared to reach toward me. But as I looked closer, something struck me. It wasn't a hand. It was a face. It was hard to tell at first, but the more I stared at it, the clearer it became. The shadow's features were indistinct, like smoke shifting in the dark, but I could see the eyes, dark, hollow, staring straight at me. I shivered as if they were looking at me through the screen, directly into my soul. I turned off the phone and stood there for a moment, heart racing. That was it. That was the answer I needed. The shadow wasn't just following me, it wanted me. It had a purpose, and I had no idea what that purpose was. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, staring at the door as if waiting for the shadow to walk through it. Every sound outside made me jump. The wind howling against the windows, the distant hum of traffic, the faintest creak of floorboards from upstairs. Each noise felt like it was amplifying the silence that surrounded me. Then, around 3 in the morning, it happened again. I heard footsteps. But this time, they weren't just behind me. They were coming from inside the house. I froze. My blood ran cold. I had locked all the doors. There was no way someone could have gotten in. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was walking was savoring each step. It was a rhythm I recognized, the same rhythm I had heard outside every night, always just behind me. But this time, it was inside. I slowly stood, my heart thudding in my chest. The footsteps were coming from the hallway, just outside the living room. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and held it in my trembling hands. My breath was shallow, my hands slick with sweat. I wasn't sure if I was ready for whatever was coming, but I knew I had no choice. With my heart pounding in my ears, I moved cautiously toward the hallway. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but there was still no one in sight. I reached the corner and took a deep breath before I turned. And there it was. The shadow. It stood at the end of the hallway, its form darker than the shadows around it. It was taller than I remembered, its limbs stretched unnaturally long, reaching almost to the ceiling. Its face, no longer hidden, was the worst part. A mask of distorted features, half human, half something else. Its eyes were wide, black as pits, and as I stared into them, I felt a coldness wash over me, a sense of hopelessness that gripped my very soul. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only watch as it stepped forward, its long fingers brushing against the walls as it moved toward me. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but my body wouldn't obey. It stopped just in front of me, its form towering over me. I could feel the cold air around it, like a dark cloud pressing in, suffocating. And then it tilted its head, as if studying me. The silence was unbearable. I was trapped. Trapped in the presence of something I didn't understand, something that shouldn't exist. And then it spoke. Its voice was low, like the echo of a distant thunderclap, but it was unmistakably clear. You shouldn't have watched. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to respond. I was frozen, paralyzed with fear, unable to do anything but stare at the thing before me. You're not safe, it continued, its voice sending a shiver down my spine. You've seen too much. Now, you'll never be free. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. Vanished into the darkness, leaving me alone once more. But I knew it wasn't really gone. It was still there, somewhere, watching. Waiting. I stumbled back into the living room, collapsing onto the couch, gasping for breath. My mind was spinning, trying to comprehend what had just happened. I had seen it with my own eyes. The thing in the shadows. It was real. And it was coming for me. I didn't know how much longer I could keep running. The next few days passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing, its dark eyes locked onto mine, its voice echoing in my mind. I couldn't escape it. I'd leave the apartment every morning, not sure where I was going, just meaning to get away. I'd find myself walking aimlessly through the city, trying to outrun the oppressive feeling that followed me everywhere. But no matter where I went, it was always there, just behind me, like an invisible weight on my back. The footsteps, its footsteps, were never far behind. I could hear them everywhere I went, faint but distinct. I'd turn a corner, and for a split second, I'd see the shadow out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. It was driving me insane. I couldn't keep living like this. I had to find a way to make it stop. To make it leave me alone. I knew I had to confront it. But how? I had already tried to ignore it, to brush it off as some kind of delusion, but that hadn't worked. I had tried to run, but it kept following me. I had tried to fight back, but it only seemed to grow stronger. There was no escaping it. There was only one thing left to do. I had to face it head on. That night, I set up the cameras again. I placed them around the apartment, aiming them at every corner, every shadowy spot where the thing might appear. I even set up one in the hallway, right in front of the spot where it had stood the last time. I wasn't going to let it catch me off guard again. I sat in the living room, my body trembling with anticipation. The hours dragged on as I waited, listening to every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside. But nothing happened. The silence was suffocating, each minute stretching longer than the last. Then, just as I thought maybe it was all in my head, I heard it. A soft sound at first, like the faintest tap on the floor. I froze, straining to hear. It came again, closer this time. The sound of footsteps. I grabbed my phone and checked the footage. The cameras in the hallway showed nothing. But I could still hear the footsteps, clearer now, echoing in the stillness of the apartment. It was like the sound was coming from within the walls. The tap, tap, tap grew louder, almost rhythmic. It was as if someone, something, was pacing just outside my door. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes darted between the cameras and the hallway, but I saw nothing. The air was heavy with tension. I could feel it, that presence, closing in on me. Then, as if on cue, the shadow appeared. It emerged from the far corner of the hallway, moving with that unnatural glide, its long limbs stretching out of the darkness. I gasped, backing away from the cameras. The figure didn't move like a person. It was more like a creature, a being of pure shadow, its form constantly shifting, warping, never quite settling into one shape. But I could see its eyes, those black pits that stared straight through me. It was looking at me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The thing was too powerful, too real. It stepped closer, its footfalls barely making a sound as it moved across the floor. I watched in horror as it reached the spot where it had stood before. It paused, tilting its head like it was studying me, waiting for something. Suddenly, it spoke again, its voice like the growl of a distant storm. "You think you can escape?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you want from me?" The shadow didn't answer right away. It just stood there, its dark gaze never leaving mine. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. I could feel it, that presence pressing in on me, suffocating me. "You are mine now," it said finally. "You've seen too much. You've walked too far." I stumbled backward, panic rising in my chest. "No, no, I'm not yours," I yelled, desperate to make it go away. But the words felt hollow, empty in the face of that thing's power. The shadow moved closer, and I could hear the faintest echo of footsteps, the same ones that had followed me, but now louder, closer. It was as if it was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every breath I took. I looked around, desperate for something, anything that could stop it. My eyes landed on the lamp, the same one I had used before to defend myself. Without thinking, I grabbed it and hurled it at the shadow. The lamp passed through the figure without resistance, crashing against the wall with a loud bang. But the shadow didn't even flinch. It didn't move. It didn't even seem to acknowledge the attack. It was as if I hadn't thrown anything at all. "Nothing will stop me," it whispered. "I am everywhere you go." I felt my legs give out beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, the weight of its words pressing down on me. It was right. There was no escaping it. The shadow leaned down, its face inches from mine. "You will never be free," it breathed, its cold, dark breath washing over me. I closed my eyes, willing it all to be over. But I knew deep down that it was just the beginning. The thing I had seen, the thing that had followed me, it was only growing stronger. And there was nowhere left to run. I woke up on the floor, my body sore and trembling. The shadow had gone, but the fear remained. I had no idea how long I'd been unconscious, but I felt like I had been pulled through a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The apartment was silent now, too silent, and the weight of that silence pressed down on me. I shakily sat up, my heart pounding. I didn't know how much time had passed, but the memory of the shadow, the dark, looming presence, was still fresh in my mind. I could feel its cold, suffocating presence in the very air around me, like it had never left. I stood up slowly, trying to ignore the growing panic inside me. I glanced around the apartment. Everything seemed normal again. No shadow, no footsteps. It was as if the terrifying event had been nothing more than a bad dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I checked the cameras. The footage showed something that made my blood run cold. The timestamp on the video was from only a few minutes ago, but there was no sign of me in the hallway, no sign of the shadow. Just empty space, the dim lighting from the hallway casting long, faint shadows across the floor. But then, just as I thought I might be seeing things, there it was. A figure standing in the doorway of my living room. It was a distortion of light, shifting and changing with every frame. It was too far for me to clearly see its features, but I knew it was there. I felt it. It was the same presence that had haunted me before, now creeping into the corner of my vision, lurking in the very frame of the camera. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my phone and checked the other cameras. There was nothing in the hallway, nothing in the kitchen, nothing in the bedroom. But the figure in the living room, it wasn't moving. It just stood there, watching. What was it waiting for? I had to confront it. I had no choice. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly being hunted by a shadow that I couldn't touch or understand. The fear, the uncertainty, it was eating me alive. I stood in front of the living room door, taking a deep breath. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, questions I couldn't answer, fear I couldn't suppress. I didn't know if I was ready, but I knew I had to do this. I opened the door slowly, stepping into the living room with trembling legs. The air was thick, almost sticky, as though the very atmosphere was heavy with something unseen. My eyes scanned the space, but I couldn't see the shadow. I couldn't feel it, not yet. I moved towards the spot where I had seen it on the camera. The silence was unbearable. I stopped and waited. My heart was in my throat. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to run, but my legs refused to move. I had to know what it wanted. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time it wasn't distant. It wasn't soft. It was right behind me. The sound was clear, unmistakable. Click, 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 like someone walking on the floorboards, just out of sight. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, and there it was. The shadow had appeared behind me, almost too fast, its form shifting, warping, blending into the darkness of the corner. Do you see it now? Its voice, that low, guttural growl, echoed around me. Do you understand? You can never escape. My legs gave way again, and I fell to my knees, unable to tear my eyes away from the thing that loomed before me. I could feel the coldness radiating from it, feel it pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. Please, I whispered, my voice breaking. Why are you doing this to me?" The shadow didn't answer. It simply moved closer, its form twisting and stretching until it was inches from me. I could see its eyes, those dark, hollow pits that seemed to absorb all the light around them. I could hear its breath, ragged and uneven, as though it were struggling to remain in this world. "You are mine," it said, its voice rising in pitch, almost frenzied now. "You are mine, and there is nowhere left to run. You thought you could hide. You thought you could escape. But you belong to me now." I tried to back away, but I was paralyzed. My mind was a blur of fear, but I couldn't think straight. I couldn't move. The shadow was everywhere now, its presence consuming everything around me. And then I heard something different. A sound that broke through the suffocating darkness, the sound of something else moving. I turned, my eyes darting across the room. And there it was. Another shadow. It emerged from the hallway, its form equally indistinct, but this one was different. It moved with purpose, with intent. Unlike the first shadow, which had been slow, uncertain, this one moved with unnatural speed. It was coming for me. I had no time to react. The two shadows collided, twisting together, their forms intertwining like living nightmares, growing larger and more powerful as they merged. The air grew colder, and I felt a surge of panic unlike anything I had experienced before. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, lost to the overwhelming presence of the shadows. And in that moment, I understood. I had never been alone. There had never been a way out. The shadows were not one. They were not a single thing, but something far worse. Something that had been there, watching me, for much longer than I could have ever imagined. And now, it was too late. I was just another part of their world. A part of the darkness that would never leave. The last thing I heard was their footsteps, louder than ever, growing closer and closer until the world went silent. I woke up in the corner of my living room, the cold floor beneath me a sharp contrast to the heat that spread through my body. The shadows were gone, but I still felt them, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to slip into that place again, where reality became fractured and unrecognizable. My breath was shallow, panic still crawling beneath my skin. I could feel it, like a constant pressure against my ribs, urging me to run, but I had nowhere to go. There was no escape from what I had experienced, no way to outrun the terror that now clung to me like a second skin. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting from one corner to the next. The shadows were no longer there, and the apartment seemed almost normal, but I knew better than to believe that. The feeling, the presence of something watching me, was inescapable. The darkness, the unknown, it was all around me, and I couldn't shake it. I staggered to my feet, my legs weak from the fear that still coursed through my veins. I reached for my phone, trembling as I unlocked it. My fingers hovered over the camera app, and I felt my chest tighten in anticipation. I had to know. I had to see if the footage had captured anything that would explain what I had just lived through. I pulled up the videos. The timestamp showed the footage from last night. I had no memory of anything after the shadows had surrounded me. But the video was all too clear. The hallway was empty. The living room was still. But there, at the edge of the frame, was something new. A figure. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was a man. Or at least, it looked like one. His features were blurry, distorted, but he was standing there, frozen in place, watching me. His eyes were hollow, like two empty pits, and his face, it didn't look right. There was something off about the way his mouth moved, as if he was trying to speak, but no sound came out. I felt my heart pound in my chest as I watched, unable to tear my eyes away. The figure didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, a silent witness to whatever this nightmare had become. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, his head tilted to one side, as if he were studying me. His gaze locked onto the camera, and for a moment, I thought I could hear his voice, low and barely audible, whispering from the depths of the darkness. "You're still here," the figure whispered, though I knew the words hadn't come from him. The sound reverberated in my mind, echoing in the quiet of the apartment. "You never left." I dropped the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The voice, the feeling of being watched, it wasn't in my head. It was real. The shadows, the footsteps, the figure, they had been real the whole time. And now they were here, in the footage, watching me even after the fact. I had tried to run. I had tried to escape. But I realized now, too late, that the shadows weren't just haunting me. They were a part of me. And as long as I remained in this place, they would never leave. I stumbled toward the door, desperate to break free from the oppressive weight of the apartment. But as I reached for the doorknob, I felt it. That chill, that familiar presence, seeping into my bones. I turned around, unable to resist the pull, and there, just inside the doorway, standing motionless, was the figure again. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I was frozen in place, my body unwilling to obey, my mind scrambling for any kind of explanation. But I knew there was no answer. There would never be an answer. The figure stepped closer, his presence swallowing the light around him. I could feel his cold breath on my skin, his eyes boring into mine, and in that moment, I understood everything. I wasn't running from something. I wasn't being pursued. I was trapped in the shadows, trapped in my own fear, and there was no escape. The figure smiled, his lips stretching unnaturally wide, revealing a mouth that was far too large for his face. His teeth gleamed, sharp and white, as if he had been waiting for this moment for far longer than I could have imagined. "You'll never be free," he whispered, his voice echoing around me. "Not now. Not ever." And then, the darkness swallowed me whole. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the camera footage on my phone, still playing, still recording the figure as it stepped forward, closer and closer to the lens. And as it moved, it smiled again, its face contorting into something unrecognizable, and I realized, too late, that the figure wasn't just watching me. It was becoming me. Have you ever heard a voice that knew you better than you knew yourself? What if it told you things you never shared with anyone, things that no one could possibly know? It sounds like the stuff of nightmares, doesn't it? But that's exactly what happened to me, and it all started one ordinary drive. It was a late evening when I first tuned into that strange radio station. The roads were empty, the car's headlights cutting through the thickening darkness. The hum of the engine was all I could hear, until, out of nowhere, the radio crackled. I wasn't expecting anything, just the usual static or maybe a local station playing some background music. But this time, there was something different. At first, it was just a voice, faint and distant. I assumed it was some late-night talk show, the kind you usually hear in the background of long drives. But as I listened, I realized the voice was speaking to me. Not to anyone else. Just me. "Tom, you're driving alone tonight," the voice said, its tone smooth, almost comforting. "No one else is in the car with you, are they?" My heart skipped a beat. I glanced around the interior of the car as if expecting someone to suddenly appear. But no one was there. Just me, the road, and the radio. How? How do you know my name? I muttered aloud, half expecting the voice to just be a figment of my imagination. Maybe some trick of the airwaves or a strange prank. But the voice continued, as calm and certain as ever. I know more than just your name, Tom. I know you've been feeling lost lately. You've been avoiding your friends, haven't you? You're isolating yourself. It's been weeks since you last spoke to anyone outside of work. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. How could it know that? My social circle had been shrinking for months, but it wasn't something I had ever talked about. I hadn't told a soul about how much I had been pulling away, hiding behind work, keeping to myself. I reached for the dial, but the voice seemed to sense my hesitation. Don't turn me off, Tom. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to talk. I froze. The urge to switch the radio off was almost overwhelming, but something held me back. The voice didn't sound menacing. It didn't sound like a threat, but there was something unsettling in its familiarity, in the way it seemed to read my thoughts. Tell me, Tom, it continued, why did you stop talking to your sister? Was it something she said? Or was it your choice? I gripped the steering wheel harder. My sister, Lisa, it had been almost 2 months since we'd last spoken. A silly argument had turned into a deep silence between us. But how could this voice know that? I hadn't even told Lisa about the argument. It felt like the radio was pulling these memories out of my mind, one by one. I don't know, I whispered, my voice barely audible as I spoke to the air. I didn't mean for things to get like this. The voice didn't respond immediately. There was a brief silence, just long enough for my thoughts to spiral. What was happening? Who was this? How was it possible that this voice knew so much about me? After what seemed like an eternity, the voice spoke again, its tone softer, almost like it was sympathizing with me. You're tired, Tom. Tired of pretending everything is okay. But it's not, is it? You know it's not. I didn't answer. I couldn't. It was like the voice was reading my mind, stripping away my defenses one layer at a time. I wanted to turn the radio off, to stop hearing these truths that felt too real, but I couldn't. The words held me captive, and the more it spoke, the more I wanted to listen. But then, just as I was about to speak, the voice changed. It became more urgent, more insistent. Tom, listen closely, it said, its tone growing sharper. In exactly 15 minutes, you will make a decision. A decision that will change everything. And if you're not careful, you might never get a chance to undo it. My hands gripped the wheel even tighter. What decision? What was this voice talking about? Before I could even process the words, the radio cut out. The static returned, louder this time, and for a moment, I thought I had lost the signal. But as I adjusted the dial, trying to find something, anything else, I realized that the voice wasn't gone. It had never left. I slammed my hand down on the radio dial, desperate to find something else, anything else. But the static kept buzzing in my ears, louder and louder, until it felt like the whole car was vibrating with it. The voice hadn't disappeared. It was still there, lurking beneath the crackle of the static, waiting to speak. Tom, it said, calm again, almost as if nothing had happened. You're still listening, I see. I told you not to turn me off. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was impossible. How was it still there? How could it know what I was doing? I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but no words came. The car seemed smaller now, suffocating. The road ahead, once familiar, now felt uncertain. My knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel, but I couldn't let go. I didn't know why, but it was like the car itself had become a cage, and the voice was the only thing keeping me locked in. "You're scared, aren't you?" The voice continued, almost like it was reading my thoughts. "You can feel it, can't you? The tension in the air. The way the world seems off. But it's not just the car, Tom. It's everything. It's you." I blinked, my eyes burning from the intensity of the road ahead. The headlights cut through the fog, but the shadows that lined the edges of the street seemed darker now, deeper. My gaze kept flicking to the rearview mirror, where the darkness seemed to press in, inching closer, like something was following. But when I glanced back at the road, there was nothing there. Just the familiar emptiness of the late-night drive. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered to the voice, my words trembling. "How do you know these things?" "Because I've been watching you, Tom," the voice replied smoothly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I've seen your life from the moment you got into that car. I've been with you all this time." A chill ran down my spine. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror again, but this time I saw something. For a split second, just a fleeting moment, there was a figure. A shadow, indistinct but unmistakable, standing behind me in the reflection. It was tall, gaunt, and its features were blurred, like it was trying to remain hidden, barely a presence in the mirror. I slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched as the car jolted forward, coming to a sudden stop. My heart was racing. I stared at the mirror, but the figure was gone. There was nothing there, just the empty back seat and the faint glow of the dashboard lights. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The stress, the isolation, the voice, it was all too much. I had to get a grip. But the voice came again, this time softer, almost gentle. "You don't believe me, do you? But you'll see. You will. Very soon." I didn't want to listen anymore. I didn't want to know what it was going to say. I reached for the dial again, desperate to turn it off, to make it stop, but my fingers froze just above the button. I couldn't move. The voice chuckled softly. "You can't escape me, Tom. You're already in too deep." I looked around, my breath shallow and quick. The fog was getting thicker, swirling in the headlights. The silence outside the car felt heavy, oppressive. It was like the world was holding its breath. "Tom," the voice said, its tone turning sharp. "It's time." Before I could respond, the car jerked forward. I wasn't driving anymore. It was like the car had a mind of its own. I gripped the wheel, but it was no use. The car was moving on its own, down an unfamiliar road that I hadn't noticed before. The streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. I tried to turn the wheel, but it didn't respond. I slammed my foot on the brake, but the pedal wouldn't budge. I was completely powerless. Then, I saw it. At the end of the road, just past the curve, a figure was standing in the middle of the street. Tall, thin, and unnaturally still. It was the same shadow I had seen in the mirror earlier. The same haunting presence. As the car sped closer, I could hear the voice again, now echoing in my mind, louder than ever. "You know who that is, don't you, Tom?" My heart slammed in my chest. The figure. I knew it. It was impossible, but I knew it. It was me. The figure at the end of the road grew larger with every second, its outline clearer, its shape more defined. I tried to look away, to make sense of what I was seeing, but my eyes wouldn't obey. It was like I couldn't turn my head, like my body had been frozen in place. The car was moving toward it, and I couldn't do a thing to stop it. The voice came again, this time almost a whisper, like it was right beside me. "Do you recognize him, Tom?" "You should." I tried to scream, to shout, to do anything to break the silence that seemed to have swallowed me whole. But nothing came out. My throat was dry, constricted. The figure stood there, motionless, waiting for me. I had seen that shape before. Not in the streets, but in my memories, in the mirror. In the briefest of glances, I'd caught it at the edge of my vision, the outline of someone I knew. But who? Who was that? Suddenly, the car lurched forward, as if propelled by some unseen force. The speedometer needle shot up, and I felt the car slam toward the figure. I gripped the wheel, desperate, but it was useless. My foot wasn't on the brake. The car was out of control. It was as if it had a mind of its own. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact. But instead of crashing into the figure, the car stopped with a violent jolt, like a hand had reached out and held it in place. I opened my eyes. The figure was standing right in front of the car, just beyond the windshield. I could see it clearly now, the tall, thin shape, cloaked in shadows. Its face was obscured by darkness, but its posture, its presence, was terrifyingly familiar. "Tom," the voice said, and this time it wasn't just in my ears. It was inside my head, crawling through my thoughts like an insidious whisper. "You've been running from this, but you can't run forever. You can't escape what you've done." I turned my head, the world spinning around me. My pulse raced. What was it talking about? What had I done? The figure in front of the car didn't move. It was like it was waiting for something. For me to speak, maybe? Or perhaps it was waiting for the truth to hit me. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. My hands were trembling. I couldn't breathe. It was like the weight of the world was pressing down on me. Then, the voice, low and dark, whispered again. "Look closely, Tom. Look at the man in front of you. The one you've been avoiding. The one you've been lying to yourself about." I didn't want to, but my eyes followed the voice's command. The figure shifted slightly, its features becoming clearer in the dim light. The shadows surrounding it began to peel away, revealing something that made my stomach turn. A face. It was mine. I jerked back in my seat, my heart slamming against my chest. My hand flew to the radio dial, but before I could touch it, the voice stopped me, its tone more forceful now. "You can't turn me off, Tom. I'm part of you. We've always been connected, haven't we?" The figure in front of the car seemed to step closer, but it wasn't moving. It was like I was the one getting closer to it. It's like my body was being pulled toward it, unwillingly, and no matter how hard I fought, I was drawn in. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice hoarse, desperate. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, the air around me grew colder, and I heard the sound of something dragging across the ground. A scraping noise, like metal on stone. The sound was coming from outside the car, closer, closer. I spun around, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The shadow from before, the one I had seen in the reflection, was there, but it wasn't just a figure anymore. It had substance now. The dark shape had taken form. It was behind me, right outside the car, watching me. I could feel its gaze through the rearview mirror, the same chilling sensation as when I had first heard the voice. The thing in the mirror wasn't just a shadow. It was something far worse. I looked back to the figure in front of me, but it was gone. The car was moving again, but I hadn't touched the wheel. It was as if I was being pulled through the darkness, driven by forces I couldn't understand. And then, just before everything went completely black, the voice whispered one final thing. "It's too late, Tom. You've already seen too much. The path you're on, it doesn't have an end." I woke up with a start, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. The car had come to a stop, but I had no memory of how or when. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned white, and my heart hammered in my chest like it was trying to break free. I was disoriented, unsure of what was real anymore. I looked around, trying to calm myself, but all I saw were the familiar, empty streets. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the streetlights casting long shadows, the same quiet hum of the engine. I glanced at the radio. The dial was silent, no voice, no whispers. Just the low buzz of static. For a brief moment, I thought I had imagined the entire thing. Maybe I had fallen asleep at the wheel. Maybe it had all been a bad dream. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had felt it. The presence. The figure. The voice. I took a deep breath and tried to steady my shaking hands. I needed to get home. I couldn't keep driving around in circles, lost in my own fear. I needed to face whatever this was. I shifted the car into drive, the engine revving to life, and I slowly pulled away from the curb. The familiar route stretched out before me, but something was different now. The air felt heavier, thick with the weight of what I had just experienced. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was then that I heard it again. The voice. "Why are you running, Tom?" It wasn't in my head this time. It came from the radio, clear as day. "You think you can outrun this? You think you can hide from yourself?" I slammed my hand onto the radio dial, but the voice didn't stop. It only grew louder. "Listen to me, Tom. You've always known what was coming. You can't deny it anymore. It's too late. You can't outrun your past." I gripped the wheel, my knuckles aching. My breath was shallow, each inhale feeling like it might be my last. "Shut up," I shouted, but the voice was relentless. "You can't escape. You've already done too much. All the lies, the things you buried, they're coming for you now." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had no idea what it was talking about. What had I done? What was I hiding? The guilt, the fear, the memories, they all started to resurface, overwhelming me. Suddenly, the car jerked again, veering off the road and onto the shoulder. I struggled to regain control, my heart racing. I managed to steer the car back onto the pavement, but the voice didn't stop. It was all around me now, filling the car, filling my mind. "You think you can keep driving away from your mistakes? But you can't. Not anymore." I looked at the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I saw something there. something I hadn't seen before. A face. It wasn't mine. It wasn't the figure from earlier. It was someone else entirely. Someone I didn't recognize, yet somehow it felt so familiar. The eyes locked onto mine, cold and unforgiving. I blinked and the face disappeared. The air around me grew colder again. The shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching toward the car like hands reaching out from the darkness. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed my foot on the brake, the tires screeching in protest. I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my own frantic breathing. When the car finally stopped, I didn't move. I didn't dare. I just sat there, frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The radio was silent now, but I could still feel the weight of its presence. I knew it was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. And then, the voice returned, softer this time, almost like a whisper. "Turn it off, Tom. Turn the car off. You can stop this now." I didn't want to. I didn't want to listen. But something inside me urged me to obey. Maybe it was the fear, or maybe it was the realization that I couldn't outrun this anymore. I reached for the ignition and turned the key. The car fell silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of my ragged breathing, the stillness around me, and the weight of the silence pressing in. But then, as I sat there in the dark, I heard something else. A sound coming from behind me. It was soft at first, like the faintest of footsteps. But as it grew louder, I realized what it was. Someone was walking toward me. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. Nothing at all. The footsteps stopped. And then, in the stillness of the night, I heard the voice one last time. "It's time to face yourself, Tom. It's time to confront what you've been running from." I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I was awake, if any of this was real, or if I was losing my mind. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone anymore. The silence in the car was deafening, but my mind was racing. I couldn't move. I couldn't think straight. I had heard those footsteps, felt the presence of someone behind me, but when I looked, there was no one there. Not a soul. Was I losing my grip on reality? Was this all in my head, a manifestation of some deep fear or paranoia I had buried somewhere? Or was there something more to this? Something I had overlooked? I sat frozen, staring out the windshield, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The radio was silent, but I could feel its presence, like an invisible force pressing in from all sides, watching, waiting. The air around me was thick with tension, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I needed to leave. I needed to get away from this. The voice, the footsteps, the shadowed figure in the rearview mirror, it was all too much. But as I reached for the car's ignition to start the engine, something stopped me. A light. Not from my car, but from somewhere in the distance. It was faint at first, like the glow of a lantern through a fog, but it grew brighter, drawing closer. A flicker of movement in the shadows. I turned my head, heart pounding in my chest. The figure was there. The same face I had seen in the rearview mirror. The eyes, cold, dark, and familiar, locked onto mine again. This time, it wasn't just a fleeting image. The figure was real. It was walking toward me. I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears, and my mind was screaming at me to run, to drive away, to escape whatever this thing was. But I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear. The figure stopped just a few feet away from the car, standing in the darkness, its features barely visible in the dim light. It was a man, tall and gaunt, wearing a long coat that blended with the shadows. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could feel his gaze on me, sharp and penetrating. I wanted to scream, to ask who he was, but no sound escaped my mouth. I couldn't form the words. The man took a step forward, and I instinctively locked the doors, as if that would somehow protect me from whatever was happening. But it wasn't enough. The air around me grew colder, and the figure reached out with a hand, tapping gently on the window. "Tom," the voice said again, this time low and steady, like a whisper that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. "You can't hide from this anymore." I closed my eyes, my breath coming in ragged bursts. The words felt like they were inside me, gnawing at my insides. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew that whatever was happening was real. This wasn't some twisted hallucination. The danger wasn't just in my mind. The man took another step forward, his fingers grazing the glass. I didn't know if I should open the window, if I should run, or if I should stay silent and hope he would go away. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't escape. I was trapped. And then, in that moment of pure, suffocating fear, the radio came to life again. This time, it wasn't just the voice from before. It was a different tone, more mechanical, as if the sound was coming from far away, like a distant signal from some other world. "Tom, it's time to face the truth," the radio crackled. "The past is calling, and it won't let you go." The figure outside the car didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting for me to react. His hand was still on the window, pressing lightly against the glass. And yet, I felt no warmth, no human touch. Only the cold, oppressive weight of something ancient, something unknowable. I realized then that the voice wasn't just narrating my life. It was part of this. Whatever this was, the voice knew more than I did. It was leading me to this moment, this confrontation. I wasn't sure what it wanted from me, but I knew I had no choice but to face it. The door to the car clicked open. My hand moved on its own, slowly, as though it had a mind of its own. I stepped out, each movement feeling like it was happening in slow motion. I faced the man in front of me, the distance between us growing smaller with each passing second. I could hear my heart beating in my ears, the world around me growing eerily silent. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, only the sound of my breathing and the hum of the distant radio. The figure reached up and pulled back his hood. I froze. It was me. The face that stared back at me, cold and detached, was my own. But it wasn't me. Not entirely. It was a version of me I didn't recognize, a twisted reflection of myself. His eyes were hollow, like two empty voids. His lips were stretched into a grin, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was something darker, more sinister. "You can't run anymore, Tom," the figure said, his voice almost mocking. "You've been running from yourself for so long. But now, it's time to stop." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The fear, the panic, the uncertainty, they all rushed back, overwhelming me. The voice from the radio crackled once more, the static humming louder now, as if it was speaking through me. "Face the truth, Tom. You have nowhere to hide." And then, just as suddenly as it all began, the radio fell silent. The figure, my reflection, was gone. And so was I. thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.